Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. The Septon. The night sky was concealed by the many clouds that seemed to spread to every corner of the narrow sea. It was going to snow soon. It could be seen coming from the west with the winds. In the other direction was another type of storm. A storm of sulls and traitors, led by a madman. The Thayan stood at the bow of his and Yara's ship, Ragnar's finger, looking out to the sea in the east. The water rose and fell gently, making it a perfect battleground on the sea. The cold winter winds picked up the tails of Thayan's coat and felt like they were pulling him to his impending fate. It all felt right to him. The feel of winds, the rock of the ship, the smell of the salt in the sea. He was an Ironborn, and he would not run again like he did the last time he fought at sea. He didn't feel afraid as he did before. Seeing Euron run from him at the Iron Islands made him feel greater than this wretched kin. The Septon took a breath of it all while he could, and scanned the eastern horizon. It was pitch black, and nothing could be seen. But he knew that Euron was out there somewhere. Close. But they wouldn't be caught by surprise this time. In fact, their plans ensured that Euron would be the one surprised. The bulk of their men were Ironborn, but there were other soldiers and sailors from the other kingdoms joining them. They were sure to need the numbers. The Reborn readying the Silence were nearly finished with its final preparations for the battle. It was time to return what Euron had left behind on Pike. His ship and his weapons from King's Landing, the Silence was a mighty vessel, unmatched by anything, but it was a hideous thing created by a monster. Dean would be the one to give it back to Euron, along with all the hate and disgust he had for his uncle. There, Yara stepped up and pointed out to a tiny flicker of light could have been mistaken for a star, had the sky not been covered. It soon became many lights, tiny and flickering to the south. She extended her mirrorish eye and gazed through the lens for a closer look before giving it to Theon for his turn. Through the enhanced sight the lens gave, Theon could barely see the shadows of ships and sails cast by the lights. "Are you sure you can do this?" Datton closed the mirrorish eye and gave it back to his sister. "I'm not running away again, and I'm not gonna sleep until he's dead." That's what I wanted to hear. Yara led him to the main deck, past all the men, arming themselves and standing by for battle. She had just as much hunger for blood as everyone else did. They approached the man in charge of preparing the Silence. "Is it ready?" "Aye," he replied. "Just needs a pair of hands at the wheel. And the line is good and secure, and her belly about to burst if we put any more in her." Yara nodded. "Go join the rest." The leader scurried off to arm himself with the other men, leaving her alone with Theon at the rear. "When we get back, we'll have the greatest feast. No king or queen of the mainland in history could ever hope to match. After that, we'll go west, to whatever lands await to found and make them ours." Yara's vision for the Ironborn was more than Theon could have hoped it to be. She spoke without a shred of doubt in her tone. She was so certain about it all, so much that no one would have the balls to second-guess her. No one except Euron. "I wish I could be more like you. Leading comes so naturally and you always know what to do. You've had your moments, you fought much better than me at the wall, and you made Euron run from you, something I never thought I could do. That was all just by chance though, nothing more." Yara rolled her eyes at him and shook her head. "Hiding a knife under your skin isn't something that happens by chance. You acted in a way no one else in the world could have. It still frightens me that you could do it. It didn't hurt that much, at least compared to everything that happened to me." The Septon could still hear the whisperings of Ramsay's voice from time to time. The words that broke him, the games he played. "I wanted to be stronger than I was. Better. You already better than that snob who came home, after nearly a decade away." Yara grew silent for a moment, and looked deeply at Theon. "If you could go back, would you have chosen differently? Stark over us." Theon didn't say anything. He only nodded ever so slightly. Yara didn't react at all, though. She looked out to the ocean, and snickered. "Good. I'd whip your arse if you chose father again. I wonder what he would say if he could see us both now. He'd disown us for even pledging to fight for another king and queen, especially Ned Stark's bastard." Theon smirked. The memory of his father, the great Balon Greyjoy, made him laugh as much as it made him angry. Everything he ever did for his father was never enough for him. All his pain and suffering he endured for the love and approval of his father meant nothing to Balon Greyjoy in the end. And then he'd kill us for giving up the Iron Way, Yara added. I always felt he saw his ego and pride were more his children than any of us. You better not be that way to your boy, or else I'll find out how to grow your cock back just to cut it off again. Billington could tell that she wasn't joking despite the impossible. Never. He's nothing like the little shit I was. Thank the gods for that. How's he feel being an heir to our house? Bella asked me not to get any of that into his head. Not yet at least. I agree with her. I want him to be a boy free of a noble name for a while. She doesn't mind him being a bastard. Ever since Jon was named king in the North as a Snow, the North's view of bastards isn't as harsh. And he still doesn't understand it quite well either. Theon turned to Yara, nervous about what he had to say next, since she brought up the subject of children. He watches over your little girl like a direwolf to a Stark. Shut up. Yara scowled. I don't want to talk about her. About who? She doesn't even have a proper name except what Bella and little Theon call her. Then name her and be done with it. I don't want anything to do with her. I understand why, I truly do. But I don't want her to grow up like Jon had to. Then do the simple thing that his uncle did and just lie. For all I care, she's yours now, and I don't want to hear any more of it. She's nothing but a reminder of what happened and a memory of our cunt of an uncle. Yara turned from her brother, leaving his presence to avoid the discussion. The Septon wished she could see his reasoning. He didn't want the babe to grow up as an outcast. And as an Ironborn, the girl's life would be rougher than what he put Jon through growing up. And there was no need for Lord Stark's lie here. Everyone would know who she was. The daughter of a maniac. The most he could hope for was that after the war is over, the Ironborn would change for the better. The Septon went to pursue Yara, not wanting to give up, but one of his men approached them both. The silence is ready, my lord. The Sanyan paused. It was time for him to command his uncle's ship and deliver it back. He nodded and followed his man. When he reached the steps, however, he turned his head back to Yara. Just promise me you won't run away from this like I did. From you. That's all I ask. Iran. It was all working so perfectly. The trap was set, and it was already luring the Lord and Lady of the Iron Islands deep into it. They wouldn't even realize what was happening until it was too late. Euron watched from the crow's nest of his new flagship, the Empty Voice, a vessel that he took from one of the Selsil captain cocksuckers, and reformed it to be just as powerful as the Silence. His niece and nephew's fleet had no idea he was watching them in the cover of shadow. At least they believed they knew where he was. They were moths drawn to the candle flame of the decoys. His fleet remained anchored, and waiting for the right moment to catch the western winds and move into formation. He would bleed to two of his brother's remaining squabs as long as he could. Every weapon and every move of his plans was meant to do just that. Many of the other captains said his strategy to be foolish and predictable. They spoke far less now without their tongues. Euron ran a whetstone down the blade of his axe as the pain in his jaw stabbed constantly. It never went away no matter how much drink or drug he took to subside the pain. He would make sure that his nephew would pay for the pain he caused. He would show him realms of it that the Bolton bastard could have only fantasized of reaching. Euron took another swipe with the stone before tossing it into the sea. His axe was sharp and hungry for blood as much as he was. A soft gust brushed him, bringing a cold of winter. It was time. Euron took hold of a rope and jumped from the nest, falling steadily to the main deck where his men were waiting in silence for him. The moment his feet touched the wood floor, he shot a glance to his helmsman. "Raise anchors," he hissed, in a whisper. His speech had become less impaired than what it once was, but it still annoyed him greatly. He made forward to the bow of his ship, full sails. The sails of Empty Voice dropped, and immediately caught the winds. The order could be heard being passed on to the other ships, and soon the sound of charging ships replaced the waves of the ocean. It was all a symphony to the drowned god. At the end of it all, drowned gods, old gods, new gods, it would matter little. Even after his niece and nephew are dead, no gods will stand between him and them in death. He would tear down the foundations of the drowned gods' halls, and burn every red-leafed tree in the world. There was no place in this world nor the next. Conquering the world was just a stepping stone to conquering death. Iana. The winds carried the silence quickly through the waters. Yara was almost having trouble keeping Ragnar's finger close enough. He almost felt smug at the wheel. To say that there was a ship greater than the Silence was a lie. To have such power at his command gave him much pride. He felt he could tame the 14 seas. Everything on the ship made him feel was exactly why this was Euron's ship. As the ship cut through the waters, with tremendous speed, Theon breathed in the smell of the sea as he took in the moment he had to himself. Nothing but him, a ship, and the ocean. It was isolation that made him feel at peace. At least, as peaceful as it would get for him. Amidst his thoughts were those of doubt and memories of words spoken by Ramsay, forming into the things that monster would say and things he never did. Rook, that's a good name for you. Theon shook his head, trying to rid himself of those words. Not Reek, Theon. He muttered to himself. I am Theon Greyjoy. The Septon Greyjoy, burner of farm boys, betrayer of brothers, the cockless lord, a crying lord. He cried when I took his favorite toy from him. Do you ever still feel an itch down there? Shut up. Septon, let's slip. The sound of the ocean was the only thing he could hear now. Despite what he told Sansa, the Theon knew he was still a broken man, haunted by his enemies and those he betrayed. He would sometimes have nightmares of Ser Roderick cutting him instead of Ramsay. Other times he dreamt of a creature with Robb's body and Grey Wind's head. The beast would attack and feast on Theon like a rabid animal with nothing but a wave of anger, so great that is shown in its eyes. He was marked by his betrayals. He could never forget it, but that was his punishment. He would not allow himself to forget what happened because of his mistakes. He wouldn't make the same ones again and be remembered as nothing but a traitor. The ghosts of his past would always haunt him. He just had to keep learning to live with them. The Silence was making incredible progress. Ragnar's finger was barely able to keep up. The Septon made sure the line of rope from the finger was still with him. If it snapped, then there would be no chance of him escaping in time. The lights of Euron's fleet were getting closer and soon they would be met with the very weapons Euron had taken from Cersei to destroy them. Theon was close enough that the ship could go on without him. He had to make for the rope that was meant to pull him back to Ragnar's finger. But something just didn't feel right. It all felt too easy. The Silence was in clear view of Euron's fleet, but there were no alarms, no calls of warning either. In fact, when Theon focused closely on the light, he started to see that they were too few and low to the surface of the water. He abandoned the wheel and rushed to the front of the ship, getting as close as he could. His heart began beating fast as his fear rose within him. He could see just barely now that the lights were of candles aboard, makeshift rafts built largely to give the illusion of a ship at a great distance. Dozens and dozens of decoys. It was all a trap, which meant Euron was the one with the true surprise attack. Thereupon Euron ran to the rear of the ship, as fast as his feet could carry, nearly slipping on the main deck. His speed was broken by the railing as he slammed into it, shouting out as loud as he could. It's fake, Yara. It's a trap. His voice was carried over the sea as far as it could go, hopefully reaching the ears of his sister. Out of panic, Theon began to look out to every bit of the surrounding darkness, trying to find any indication or sign of the real position of Euron and his fleet.
Euron!
Bells began to ring across the fleet of his niece and nephew. They realized what they fell into, but it was too late. The speed of Eurion's fleet was breaking through the waves and ready to decimate everything in its path. Euron stood at the bow of the ship, fully armored and an axe in hand. He faced his men and glared the utter viciousness he felt at all of them. Mark my words. No man shall meet the drowned god unless he drowns in the blood of our enemies. No man will feast in his halls unless the sea is filled with the songs of shrieming traitors. All of his men cheered heavily for him, yelling out his name for a battle cry. Euron! 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 He turned to one of his men standing by at the rear. Give the signal, bombard them. The whelp of an ironborn set a torch alight and began waving it to all the ship behind the empty voice. Before the sky was to light up with balls of fire, Euron made for the front of the ship. He looked out to the boats in their path as the shadows of the night finished all they could, covering the fleet in darkness. The first to fall to him was a small thing that sported a sail with a sigil of Mainlander House. Euron didn't care for. The men aboard had just spotted the true Iron Fleet and began shouting warnings, but it was too late for them. The empty voice rammed into the bow of the ship, tearing through the wood and nearly cutting the entire front of the ship off. Archers to the ready, port shied, the Ironborn aboard with bows all lined up and knocked arrows to their strings. The arrows Euron supplied were barbed and designed to pierce flesh, but not exit. Fire at will. Arrows began flying across to meet their targets. Shouts of pain began to warm the depths of Euron's heart. This was a testament that this will be his greatest battle. The little ship was sinking quickly, as the empty voice pushed what remained out of its path. Men who had jumped into the water were shot one by Euron's archers. The sky began to fill the light of fiery bombardment. The ordnance rained down on the ships that were meant to challenge Euron's fleet but failing miserably so far. Decks and sails erupted in flames, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of smoke and burning flesh. Another ship was in sight, but this one was one of the ships Theon and Yara stole from him. It was time he began taking back what was his. Starboard. Grapples to the ready. Captain. Euron turned to the one who called to him. The silence. He pointed in the opposite direction. Everyone was attacking, over to a ship sailing straight for them and fast. Retake the silence. Euron rushed over to the other side of the empty voice, and did not have to look carefully to know that it was indeed his true ship, returning to him. And the one who dared to man her helm was little Theon. Alone. There wasn't a single man besides him aboard the silence. Evade! Euron called out. The empty voice moved as quickly as it could to get out of the ramming path. Theon was aiming for. Euron took to a better vantage point on the helm and locked eyes with Theon. His grip on his axe tightened as excitement began to rise within him. Finally, he would have his chance to pay back what Theon had taken from him. He ignored the stinging in his face as he smiled for the first time since his injury. The silence grazed the starboard side of the empty voice, and immediately grapples were thrown to catch it. Men pulled with all their might to keep the silence in tow. Euron shoved through his men, and was the first to jump over to the deck of his ship. The moment his feet landed, he felt he was back on the real throne of the Ironborn. He looked up to the helm with his axe tightly in hand and saw his nephew standing on the railing, holding onto a rope for balance. The cockless fool was smiling at him. "She's all yours." Tim turned and dived off into the water, abandoning the mightiest ship in all the 14 seas. While Euron's men laughed at his nephew's supposed cowardice, Euron remained silent. Theon was an idiot, but not enough of one to just give up the silence like this. Euron began inspecting the deck of his ship, walking to the helm and noticing the floorboards drenched in something wet. In the light of flames racing across the sky in each direction, the wetness reflected and revealed a luminescent green. Euron felt a rush of caution take over as he began inspecting every part of his ship. There was nothing he could see above deck, but below could be hidden. What he feared. Rushing down the steps, his eyes fell upon the cargo his ship carried, and all sense of triumph left him. Stored in the bowels of his ship was all of the wildfire he had brought to the Iron Islands before losing it all to Theon and Yara. All of it was rigged to be ignited, and there was enough to destroy every ship surrounding the silence. "Retreat! Back to the Vleish," he shouted as he rushed back up. Wildfire. Wildfire. Euron pushed past many to return to the empty voice. He called out to his helmsman, "Evade! Evade!" A small flash of green turned his vision back to his true ship. The main deck was struck with a flaming arrow, and the floorboards ignited instantaneously. The green flames traveled rapidly across the deck and down to the wildfire below. The empty voice moved as quickly as the wind could carry it, leaving behind some who remained on the silence. But when a faint pop was heard, Euron had lost all hope of evasion. Without even thinking, he dropped his axe, ran for the port side and jumped ship, diving into the cold seawater. The moment he went under, the ocean shook as the silence exploded in green flames, igniting all of Euron's ships that were too close, including the empty voice. Through the water, Euron could hear muffled screams of his men and watched many of them dive into the sea to douse the flames that covered them, but it was of no use. The water had suddenly become increasingly hot, almost boiling. He looked up to the surface above him and saw only green flames were there, waiting for him to surface for air and devour him. His lungs began to burn and scream. He had a choice between drowning or burning. Euron popped his head out of the water and took a deep breath. But the very air itself burned his throat, and the skin of his face was roasted as the flames cooked it. Yara! Never before had such a sight been more beautiful. Yara did nothing to fight back her smirk when she saw the silence explode in wildfire, and many of Euron's ships surrounding it, catching the spray of green flames and igniting with no hopes of survival. But to see Euron's ship with him aboard go up in flames almost made her swoon. But this would be the only satisfaction that she, Theon, and their crew would get. In order to reach Euron, they had to steer right in the middle of the crossfire of ships. Currently, the only ones around belonged to Euron, and they were making a mess of the Iron Fleet. So far, pull faster, Yara barked out as her men tugged on the rope that Theon was holding onto. At the rate they were pulling, not even a bloody shark would be able to catch her brother. He was nearly back at the ship and almost slammed into the hull. Slow it down, Yara gathered with one of her other men and reached down to pull Theon back aboard. When he got close enough to reach, salt water dripped heavily from his armor and clothes. Despite the freezing ocean water in the winter season, the Theon hardly shivered at all. "Are you cold?" Yara asked, as a coat was brought to Theon and wrapped over his shoulders. "It's not as bad as sleeping in the kennels," Theon told her, and he wiped himself as dry as he could before shrugging the coat off and retrieving his sword belt. After he tied it to his waist, he stood with Yara and faced their men as the battle raged on. There was an awkward silence until Yara turned to her brother. "You're the Lord. You're the leader. Yara, just lead." She could see Theon swallow hard as all eyes fell upon him. But then she saw him steel himself and stand tall. "There are men out there who want to fuck us. Are we going to let them?" "Nay," some of the men called. "Look where we are now. Look at what centuries of the Iron Price have brought us. Nothing but reavers of what other men do better than us. No more. When this war is over, we shall usher a new age for the Ironborn, an age of glory and might unmatched by any in the entire world." Aye, all the men began to cheer. "Tonight the seas will run red with the blood of our enemies, of pitiful sailors calling themselves soldiers, and men who will see you hang before fighting beside you again. They will be eaten by worms in the dirt, and those who die fighting them will meet the drowned god proudly. Aye, tonight we will fight a battle so fierce, our children and theirs, after them, will only dream to fight as glorious as we. Aye, what is dead may never die. What is dead may never die." Every man listening raised their weapons high and let the ocean tremble with their war cries. Theon turned his head to Yara and saw her looking proudly at him. It felt good to hear a little bit of the cocky prick she once knew. The light of the wildfire began to subside as the shadows of enemy ships broke through the flames. The sky was beginning to light up from the flames of fireballs being catapulted from both sides. Yara and Theon drew swords together and looked out to the first ship in their path as it waited to be taken and boarded. The iron ram of Ragnar's finger broke into the hull of the ship, splintering wood and thrashing the body so hard that its crew fell to their sides. Yara and all others yelled out as they boarded their prey of a ship and began fighting like Ironborn, of legend. The first to meet Yara's sword was a sellsword. She swung a spiked flail at Theon. The steel spikes grazed Yara's hair as he ducked down just in time to avoid it and stab his sword into the sellsword's neck. The Septon charged with their men after Yara pulled her sword free, roaring out as they clashed with treacherous Ironborn and sellswords, recovering from the crash. They fought together as a brother and sister should, and together they were defeating those that stood against them. These men were Sells, not Ironborn, and they had not a chance to defeat the Greyjoys of Pike. Yara sliced her blade across a man's throat, and then drew one of her axes from her belt and threw it into the back of a foolishly unarmored enemy. She heard a grunting behind her and quickly turned to see that a traitor Ironborn was holding a spiked mace to kill her, but Theon had impaled the bastard from behind before he could. Yara smirked proudly at him as he withdrew his blade and resumed the fight. Amidst the sounds of war and battle, the ferocious roar of a man broke through. The volume and intensity were that of a blood-crazed animal. Yara turned to the source and saw Euron at the bow of a ship, set to ram the one she was on. It was hard to recognize it was him. His face was covered with burns, his hair was gone, and he no longer looked human, but more of a demon from the Seven Hells. Euron jumped from the bow of his ship with a new spiked battle-axe in hand. He landed the bladed into the shoulder of one of his own men, and tore through him without any regard. He attacked anyone who got in the way of his vision, and he was coming straight for Yara. Yara felt a hand on her shoulder and nearly killed who it was attached to, but stopped in time when she saw it was Theon. Together this time, he told her. Yara nodded. Aye, together. They both pushed through the fight to meet their uncle. One way or another, it would be for the last time. Euron was in a crazed berserker rage. He fought with incredible strength and no fear or care of receiving an injury. Yara and Theon's only advantage would be Euron's reckless fighting. But compared to the rest, they had to worry about. The odds did not look good. They had to fight smart. Take his left. I have his right, Yara told her brother. They split up, and when they got close, attacking Euron at once. But he could read them, easily despite his careless and rageful fighting. He stepped out of reach of their swords and focused on getting Theon out of the way. He rammed the butt of his axe into Theon's knee and then kicked him in the face when Theon buckled down. Euron quickly changed focus to Yara and smiled maniacally at her. The iron plate holding his jaw dug into his skin so much that it made him bleed. Loving wife, where's my babe? He started laughing out as he swung his axe at Yara. His strength was so great that she could barely withstand his attacks. Yara drew a knife from her belt and threw it at Euron. It would have found its mark had Euron not parried it with his axe blade. At this point, Euron started moving about the deck of the ship when Theon had gotten to his feet again. He making sure that they didn't corner him, but also toying with them. Yara yelled out as he clashed steel and parried Euron's axe, but was met with an elbow to her face. Theon had taken Euron's attention for enough time for Yara to thrust at Euron's head, but he was so quick, the blade missed her mark, but cut across the side of Euron's head and lopped off the top half of his left ear. Euron spun around and bashed his axe into Yara, pushing her back while he fought Theon alone. Her brother was holding his ground well enough. Euron had butted the shaft of his axe into Theon's head, and then followed with a heavy kick in between Theon's legs. But to Euron's surprise, Theon was not affected by the attack at all. In fact, it caught Euron off guard for just enough for Theon land a slash across Euron's shoulder. Some of Euron's men had interfered then. They got in between Theon and Euron, and kept him from helping Yara. He was fighting as hard as he could to get back to his sister, but it would be maybe a few moments, and that was a lifetime in a battle. Euron made heavy swings with the axe, forcing Yara to back away. He had no indication of feeling the pain or stress of his wounds, despite how much he was bleeding. Yara was backed into a mast and ducked in time to avoid Euron's axe taking her head off. As the blade landed in the wood and got stuck, she drew one of her small axes from her belt and swung it into Euron's leg. She could feel that the blade stopped at the bone. It cut so deep, but Euron grabbed hold of Yara's hand when she tried to pull it out. Yara felt the slam of Euron headbutting her right in her face. She instinctively clenched her eyes shut at the feeling of the pain and lost her balance as she stepped backward, but then she felt Euron's axe hook her foot and trip her to the floor. She fell back hard, dropping her sword in the process. When Yara opened her eyes, she saw Theon getting thrown to the ground by Euron after breaking through his men. Everything became a sudden blur in her vision, and the only thing her eyes managed to focus on was Euron with his axe raised high in the air. He yelled out and had a look of absolute murder in his eyes as he swung his weapon down at her. The axe blade cut into her armor and proceeded into the left side of her chest. The steel of her breastplate stopped the axe from going completely through, but she could feel the pain and damage she had taken. Her ribs were broken, her muscles severed, and more. Cowan. He froze where he laid on the deck. He watched Euron pull his axe out of Yara. She wasn't getting up. She only bled so much. His hands began to shake. He could feel the terror overcome him again at the sight of sister's defeat, but it became much more so when Euron turned his gaze at him and his uncle smiled, devilishly licking the blood from around his mouth. Run away, Reek. Run away like you always do. You're no kraken. Just a pile of stinking meat that reeks. The Septon would not let his fear win this time. He shouted out as loud as he could to block out the voice of pain in his mind as he got to his feet and charged forth to kill his uncle. Euron turned to see his nephew come for him. The axe was stuck in Yara's armor, and it took him a second to pry it free. But it was a second too long. Theron swung his sword only to have it caught by the shaft of the axe, but it was caught where Euron was holding it. Theron cut off Euron's index and middle finger of his right hand. Euron didn't even seem to notice as he swung his axe at him. The blade sliced across Theon's right shoulder and hooked his sword out of his hand. Theon drew a dagger he had and charged at his uncle with all his strength. He pushed Euron into the railing of the ship and started stabbing his uncle's leg, and many times as he could. Euron grabbed Theon's hair, pulled him up so that he was face to face and headbutted him hard. Theon dropped his dagger and fell to his knees, but forced himself to fall all the way to avoid Euron's axe slicing at him. Without any weapon, Ditton wasn't sure what to do. He needed something to fight with, and he needed it fast. He dodged another one of Euron's attacks, finally giving up on finding a weapon and decided to use what the gods gave him. He dodged another attack and used this chance to charge at his uncle again. This time he wrapped his arms around Euron as tight as he could and did not let go. Then he opened his mouth and sank his teeth into Euron's neck, biting as much flesh and as hard as he could. Euron screamed out in pain as Theon tore out a used piece of flesh and blood started rushing out of the wound. His uncle finally collapsed but was still alive. Nathaniel's blood boiled when he had no weapon in his hand, and none within his reach. He needed something sharp, anything to finish the job. He found what he was looking for when the light of a fireball flying overhead glinted off the piece of metal holding Euron's jaw together. Vinton forced his fingers into his uncle's mouth. He grabbed at his jaw and pulled with every bit of strength he could. The feeling of tearing Euron's jaw off was just like tearing a drumstick off a roast chicken. The feeling of the snap made him pull harder. With one motion, Theon ripped off Euron's jaw and had himself a new dagger. The piece of iron was shaped well enough to work as a blade. He plunged it over and over into the wound he made in Euron's neck, yelling out as he did. As the blood of both previous wounds squirted onto Theon, staining his armor, clothes, and face, Theon found himself losing the rage-filled energy when Euron's squirms and screams ceased. He left the jawbone planted in Euron's body as he rolled off and took a deep breath. For a second only, Theon could not hear the sound of the battle, nor the sound of the ocean, only a silence that felt so peaceful. He rolled over and got to his knees as the battle rages on. He looked around and saw many of his men slaughter others and push back the invading crew. He found the body of his sister in the clear of the fighting and amidst other bodies. He got to his feet and hurried as fast as they carried him to her. Yara. Depton fell to his knees next to her and lifted her up into his arms. His sister coughed up a mouthful of blood as he did and groaned painfully. Oh gods, Yara. The wound on her body was deep and she already lost so much blood. Theon, Yara spoke in a cough, past the blood in her throat. Did you kill the fucker? Aye, he's dead by his own jaw. Depton held her softly, but at the same time, it felt as tight as he could. He held on, hoping that she wouldn't slip away from him. Then there's no one to challenge you. You better not cock up as king, or I'll haunt you till death. Yara, no. I can't be king. I can't lead like you. Yara coughed up another motherful of blood. You don't have a choice, little brother, she moaned heavily, and nearly screamed out. But she hadn't the strength to do so. Her breathing became softer after that, or rather it became weaker. Yara then wanted to cry for her, but he could see her glaring at him, not to. She wanted him to be fierce now. He had to be. Alice, call her Alice. The Septon looked at her in brief surprise. For what she said before the battle began, this was unexpected to him to hear. But hearing that gave him some peace in all of this. Yara, before the Mayan could give any form of a reply, his sister's head turned limply to the side and her eyes fell void of any life. He wanted to cry, shout, scream, something. But if she were still alive, she would tell him not to. He only let himself hold her body in his arms. There are too many, one of the Ironborn shouted, and the ship jerked harshly. Was a second ship rammed into the hull, and sellswords began to board and attack. Fall back to the finger, Theon yelled. He picked up Yara's body as he stood to retreat. His men surrounded and protected him as he made his way back to his ship, but their escape was cut off when a third ship had entered the fray. But this one rammed into the side of Ragnar's finger and cut through nearly half of the body. Ragnar's finger immediately began to sink into the ocean and men aboard returned to the ship that was still afloat, but not for much longer. They were surrounded on all sides. The Septon counted about 24 of his men were left, and they were going to become heavily outnumbered as a galley was coming their way to join the attack. There was no escape, not this time. This would be the final stand of Theon Greyjoy. Theon set Yara's body down on the deck underneath a stairway to be away from the battle, and picked up a sword. He raised it high in the air, and bellowed out with all his might as a Greyjoy and a Stark. What is dead may never die. His men roared out as great warriors to never be forgotten, as Ironborn. What is dead may never die. The Septon pushed forward and led them in a charge to hold back the attackers. If he could take their ship, then they would have a chance. They just had to get through this with enough left alive. Tyrion hacked into the head of some older man who nearly killed a younger Ironborn. Tyrion pulled the lad up to his feet, as before, meeting the shield of a new man. The fury that coursed in his veins from fighting his uncle still remained, and he let it fuel his strength. He hacked the shield into splinters, breaking his enemy's arm before taking the opening made to stab him in the face. But from behind a cloud of smoke that drifted onto the deck of the ship Theon meant to claim, dozens of men burst through and leapt into battle. The numbers were even now, but it would be long until they were too much for Theon and his men. It did not stop Theon. Every time his clashed steel, he made sure to have his find the mark of flesh as quick as he could. One more, he kept thinking to himself as the sellswords kept appearing as if from magic. Every time he killed one, he thought to himself when he found a new one to defeat. One more. His hands were beyond the point of stinging with pain. His grip was becoming loose, but he had to force himself to tighten it. If needs be, he would tie his hand on with a rope, just to keep fighting. The Septon caught a glance of the galley approaching. The men aboard had already thrown grapples that caught the ship, and were pulling themselves to a line right, so that they could board in heavy numbers in little time. Theon looked all around. His men were fighting with utter power that he had never witnessed, but it wouldn't be enough. There were less than 20 of them left, and Theon could see the exhaust they all had. He himself felt the strength to stand almost leave him. To keep himself up, then let out a great bellowing roar to the smoke and clouds above, mocking the gods above the ocean that he would not die as he lived these past several years. What he did not expect was to be answered back. A great roar erupted from the sky, not from gods, but from a dragon. Daenerys. The sea was filled with the sounds of death and war, so much that it would echoes from the shores of Westeros all the way to Essos. But it did not compare to the thunderous sound that could tremble the world itself. From above, in the clouds, a great roar broke through every sound, thought and action, and instilled a great terror into those who had never heard such a noise. Soaring down through a break in the smoke and clouds, the black shadow of the mightiest of the three dragons dived through. The beat of its wings rocked the seas itself, and pushed ships to rock heavily, nearly toppling them. Daenerys looked at the many ships around, and could see the banners that were not those of Theon and Yara. Banners of red-eyed krakens and sigils not of Westeros. Her targets. Drogon felt her feelings and intentions and flew to those that flung balls of fire at them in the sky. Though the wind howled loudly as Drogon flew, it did not drown out the call of his mother. Daenerys. An inferno of dragonfire burst forth from Drogon's mouth and rained down upon the enemy ships. The force was devastatingly incredible, destroying ships in a great explosion when they met the great flames. In one pass alone, over a dozen ships were completely annihilated. As Drogon circled, Daenerys caught sight of a sinking ship, swarmed by others. The strange thing was, all the ships had the same banner. But barely by the light of the flames of burning ships, Daenerys saw the sinking flag of Theon and Yara's ship. She looked closely and could see a group of Ironborn fending off a great many numbers of men and about to face even more. In the middle, one of them was waving a sword at her. Drogon banked around when they passed, and Daenerys set her sights on the galley about to board them. Drogon hovered over the frenzy of fighting, and immediately men from the galley began to jump off the ship into the ocean. But that water would not save them. They would be boiled alive. Drogon, be careful not to hit our friends, Daenerys called out to her child. She could feel the caution he heard as he took aim and let forth another burst of flames. It missed the galley and hit the water, but the spread of the flames traveled up the side of it and set fire to only it. The galley acted as a shield protecting the ship Daenerys' allies were on. She heard a mixed cheering from her allies and screaming of her enemies after that, as Drogon turned his head and set fire to other surrounding ships. Drogon, destroy the other ship. Tear it apart. Daenerys gripped tightly and Drogon dived down at the other ship, attacking the Ironborn. Instead of flames, Drogon used the talons of his feet and ripped the ship in half. As her dragon gained air, Daenerys could see that there were some ships beginning to flee the battle, and they were all her enemies. She guided Drogon to fly over to them, and he set fire to a great many ships that were bought and paid by Cersei. Daenerys would make sure that this night and this battle would mark her promise to fight for those who have pledged to her, and all who would fight against her should run before trying. The sea was beginning to be filled with burning ships after Drogon made several more passes. Smoke would rise into the clouds, and the flames almost as high. But as quick as a ship was ignited, it only took twice as long for it to sink and extinguish. Finally, the bombardments had stopped. The enemy ships that could retreat from the battle in were numbers too great for Drogon to intercept. But he didn't need to, for it was clear that they would never be seen again. Daenerys would let those who fled spread the tales of what happens when they challenged a fleet of Ironborn, Targaryen and a dragon at sea. Daenerys had Drogon bank around the surviving fleet. Many ships were damaged, but twice as many were captured. There were men cheering out for her and her dragon loudly for victory. Among the sound of cheering was a single horn coming from a ship leading a dozen others away from the battle. Drogon flew over, and Daenerys could barely see that the horn blower was Theon. He was waving for her to follow him and his ships. The light of the morning was beginning to brighten the world, even though the sky was filled with clouds and smoke. They were led to a small islet just a few miles from the lands of the Vale. Dan had anchored his ship, and Daenerys had Drogon land in a patch of tall grass. When she dismounted, she could see that Theon and many of his men had rowed to meet her. His armor and clothes were stained with the crimson of blood. Daenerys rushed to meet Theon before noticing that his sister was missing. She looked at him with worry. "Yara?" The Theon only shook his head. "I avenged her. I stabbed Euron to death with his own jawbone." His words were filled with both sorrow and rage. He turned his head, gesturing to some of his men carrying bodies to the shore. "He will never meet the drowned god, and neither with his men. They'll become food for worms and maggots." Daenerys had no quarrel with that. Men such as that did not deserve respect in death. Anton turned back to her. "I want to send Yara off, right? The way she deserves to leave. Will you honor her by being there?" Daenerys smiled warmly at him, hoping that he might be comforted. "I will." The light flurry of snow from the north had caught up, and was gently falling all around. The white was mixed with the gray ash of burning ships, still in embers at sea. It had been a sorrowful night, filled with much death, that it was good to have it end with a bit of peace. Daenerys stood next to the Theon, and several of their loyal captains, as they finished preparing Yara's body to be carried away by a boat to the sea, and the drowned god. The Fazan placed Yara's sword in his sister's hands carefully, and stood as tall as he could. He looked out to the clear part of the sea that was aside from the battle. His jaw was trembling slightly, but there were no tears in his eyes. I didn't want what should have been yours. The seas are yours now, all of them. What is dead may never die, but rises again. Harder and stronger. What is dead may never die." Daenerys did not join the captain's repeat of the Ironborn words, as it was not her place to. Dan's eyes fell upon her, offering a moment for any words from her. Daenerys spoke soft, but firm. "I am a dragon. I do not answer to gods, but if Yara Greyjoy is denied a place in the halls of the drowned god, he shall tremble before her might in doing so. No warrior was ever as fierce as her, or loyal. She was a true queen to her people, and shall be remembered rightfully as one." Dickion and 3 of his men pushed the boat as they walked into the cold, salty waters of the narrow sea. None of them looked affected by the temperature. When they were up to their knees in water, they gave a mighty push, and Yara was set free to be carried by the waves into the ocean. The men returned and were given thick cloaks, as the cold of the snow was starting to make them shiver. They might have just done enough to make them sick, but their devotion and loyalty outweighed the consequence of that. Daenerys stole the company of Theon from his men. She could see that he was in great pain for the loss of Yara. Whether it matched what Ramsay Bolton had done, she could not tell, but it felt like it. He looked broken. He looked like the person who presented himself to her in Mereen. "The battle for the Salt Throne is won. You've done all you needed and more." Danson turned his head and his expression immediately hardened. "But not enough. The war isn't over, and we're not going to stop fighting until it is. I abandoned one brother once. I'm not doing that again."
Daenerys knew what Theon was referring to and nodded in silent agreement.
For Robb Stark was her brother, as much as he was Theon's, and she knew there was little justice they could bring to those who had murdered him. His willingness to go back instead of end it now was inspiring. She saw something light up in the other man's eyes as he walked away from her. Being approached his captains and other men. I want every ship clean of damage to set sail for King Landing. We are going to kill every fucking one of Cersei Lannister's men. His gaze found the Ironborn unloading the body of his uncle. Wait, he called out to them. I have a new plan for my uncle. Find some rope. He turned back to Daenerys. We'll escort you to the battle, your grace. Daenerys smirked before she went back to her Drogon and mounted him. Defian and his men were already rowing back to their ships. It was time to join the fight against the Mad Queen. Arya. Everywhere a step was taken, there was shit. It was expected, of course, since the only path to travel without detection was in the city sewer. But the damn place had so little maintenance that it was the very definition of the very word shit. They had all entered through a drainage grate just outside the east side of the city during the earliest part of the morning. There was barely any light coming from the horizon when they moved to infiltrate the city. Any less and it would have been too dark to see. Any more and it would have been too bright and they would have been seen. The four of them trudged through the waist of the city. It came up to the ankles of their boots and was thick as mud. If anyone speaks of this after today, I'll tear their arms off and murder their family with them, Sandor growled. Believe me, Jaime said back as he led them through with a small lantern to light their way. I'm going to do everything I can to Wilg, he gagged out as he spoke. To forget this. Brienne proved at the entrance that she did not have as strong a stomach as everyone else. She threw up constantly as they walked through the cold sewers. Surprisingly, Arya didn't mind it all that much. It made her remember her time on the road with the Night's Watch and in Harrenhal. She never got a chance to bathe and smelled foul so often that she grew used to the smell. Why Septongea was having trouble with the smell was questionable. He spent a year stuck in a cell covered in his own filth. Arya heard from Eolis then, who heard it from her father about the time Septongea spent as Robb's prisoner. They all remained mostly quiet apart from the groans of the horrid stenches that were trapped with them in the sewers. It felt like an hour had gone by, and the series of tunnels they were walking through was a gigantic maze. The route Jaime took felt like they were going around in circles. The filth they walked in was freezing aside from horrid smelling. Arya could feel her feet starting to sting from the cold, but they just kept on walking, because there was no place to stop. Eventually they came to an opening in a dark passageway that resembled a hall of sorts. The filth they walked through had stopped and filled into a pool of sorts that they stepped out of and finally onto a floor of dirt. Oh, thank the gods, Brienne praised as she rushed out and kicked her boots free of any muck she could. That was one of the worst experiences of my entire life. As everyone followed her example and kicked their boots clean, Jaime chuckled at her. I think I'd rather fight the bear pit of Harrenhal than go through there again. Brienne showed a smile from that while Arya exchanged wondering looks with Sandor. Do you know where we are? Arya asked. Not exactly, Jaime admitted, but I can guess we're underneath the base of Visenya's hill. We'll find out soon enough. Jaime held up his lantern and resumed leading them through the darkness. They walked among the shadows that faintly shone from the dim light cast by the lantern. The lines of the stones forming the walls looked like snakes shivering down to the dirt floor. The cold in the passageways was worse than the sewer tunnels, almost enough to remind them all of the war with the dead. They pressed on in silence, passing other corridors and passageways, hopefully heading in the right direction of the Red Keep. After they turned the corner into a new hall, in the midst of the shadows was a luminescence of light, green light. Jaime halted and tightened his grip on his lantern. It looks like we found the wildfire. They proceed with caution as they stepped through soggy dirt that stuck to their boots. The barrels containing the wildfire were dripping lightly and soaking the dirt. There must have been 24 aligned on each side of the hallway. But when they passed at one section, they came to a fork in the tunnels, when a morbid feeling fell upon all of them. And now we found the rest. The Hound grumbled. Down each corridor were rows of barrels dripping with wildfire. There had to be 100 lined up on each wall. Enough to destroy Winterfell 5 times over, and enough to destroy one part of the city. Weren't there some who were clearing it all out? Brienne asked. Aye, Arya said. Turncloaks from the Golden Company loyal to House Targaryen. Do you think they're still down here? Brienne asked openly. Doesn't look like it, Sandor said. If I die covered in shit and fire, I'll murder whoever chose to go in the fucking sewer. To Arya's recollection, it was Yaime's idea. The glance Yaime gave him confirmed it. We're wasting time, Kimi said, as he pressed on. The number of barrels did not end, it seemed. Every time they turned a corner, there were more barrels waiting to be found. Seeing so many made it hard to believe that anyone was down here working at all, or that they were adding more barrels instead of getting them out. Finally, Jaime led them all to a passage free of green luminescence and barrels of wildfire. For once, it was comforting to have the shadows and darkness surround them. Something about the glow of wildfire gave a sickly feel to everyone. Suddenly, Yaime halted. He set down his lantern on the ground and covered the light with his cloak. Shh, there's a noise. It sounds like footsteps, he whispered. Arya stepped to the front of the line and closed eyes, letting all her focus go to one of her senses. She barely heard a thing, but there was something, the rustling and scrunches of dirt being walked on. There was more than one set of footsteps, at least 5. Arya's hand crept to Needle's hilt as the sound became clearer, and so did the noise of voices. She opened her eyes and saw the flickerings of light. Be ready, Arya whispered as she slowly and quietly drew Needle from the scabbard. The others were just as quiet as they drew their swords. As the torchlight and voices were as close as they needed to be, Arya sprang from the corner with Yuma right behind her, and surprised several men. She knocked a candle out of a red-headed young man's hand and then whacked his leg with Needle before making him trip and fall. Wait, the red-headed man said as he scurried backward into his companion's candlelight. Sir Jaime, it's me. Abola, Yene, Sandor, and Brienne had all halted, but kept their weapons up. I was with Jon when we got you out of the city. I'm just glad I wasn't with him in Dorne. Things were beginning to make sense now. Arya let out a relieving breath. They're the turncloaks. She sheathed Needle and offered a hand to the red-headed man who kindly accepted it. My name is Duck, the redhead informed. What are doing back here, sir? Jaime sheathed widow's wail. You haven't heard? The Targaryen army is outside the city gates. When the sun rises, the battle for King's Landing will begin. When you're living in darkness for months, the only things you hear are rats. One of the other turncloaks commented. He was the eldest of the group. We barely go above ground, Duck told them. Only when we need to steal food. Even then, we go at night. We haven't seen the sun for... How long has it been since you won your war with the dead? Almost 2 months, Arya told them. Forgive me, but who are you? I don't think this place is where little girls should be. Arya didn't even blink at the unintended insult. I'm Arya Baratheon, Lady of Storm's End, and I'm here to help murder Cersei Lannister. Doc's eyebrows shot up before turning his gaze to Sir Jaime. You're all here for that? Yaren nodded. We passed a cache of wildfire on our way here. A large one. It doesn't look like you've made much progress. One of the other men grew angry. We haven't a damn bit of progress. Do you know what we have to do? We can't have light to move the barrels, and it's already a maze down here. The eldest was standing next to him, and put a hand on his shoulder to calm and comfort him. They all had weary looks about them now that Arya really looked at them. They were thin and looked sickly. Duck shook his head. We started dumping the stuff into the sea at first, but that was taking too long. We've been mixing it with thick mud and burying it deep into the ground. But even still, if it's lit, too much of the city won't be spared when the flames start to spread. This was shocking and angering to hear. It wasn't that the efforts made were not enough, but it's that they were so limited that what was done already was barely worth something. We can stop this if we kill Cersei, Arya told them, in hopes to bring up their spirits. Can you lead us to the Red Keep? Duck turned to the men with him. Rowan, the maps. A dark-skinned man just a few years older than Duck approached, and retrieved 2 maps he had stored in his shirt. Jaime retrieved his lantern and shined the light on the parchments, illuminating both of them to show that one was filled with many markings of passages underneath King's Landing, and the other was of the city above. We're about right here. Duck pointed his finger onto the map. We're just north of the Hook. There's a tunnel that leads into the cellars underneath the Red Keep, but there are guards posted there, and we're outnumbered and had to trade our weapons and armor for tools and food. We could not steal. We'll take care of them, Arya said. They must have found out we're coming. Duck shook his head. Those guards have been there for as long as we have been down here. There's a large cache of wildfire they're protecting, aside from the entry to intruders. Brienne scoffed. No doubt to blow up the Red Keep. Arya looked over both maps and noticed that the one that showed the underbelly of the city had many X's drawn on it, and some of them were circled. What are these markings for? The Chrysars are caches of wildfire we've found, and the circled ones are caches we've cleared out, Duck informed. Arya took the map of the city and laid it over the other map to align so that they matched positions. After getting a clear image of the streets and notable locations, she moved the city map off and noticed a pattern. I think I see how it works. What do you mean? Duck asked. The way it works is if one cache is ignited, then everything surrounding it will explode after it and continue on. Aye, I can see that, said Arya. But the way everything is positioned, it looks like it's going to start at the Red Keep and spread from there. If Cersei is going to turn King's Landing to ash, it's going to start where it's closest to her, not somewhere else far away. Duck and his men looked in denial about it, at first, but then they all looked back and forth between maps and thought of the logic of Arya's words. They started to angrily agree with what she said. All this time, one of them growled. All this fucking time. For fuck's sake, Sandor said to all of them. Are you going to bitch about it and waste time, or are you twats going to show us who we need to kill? Duck folded both of the maps and gave them back to the one he called Rowan. Follow me. Duck relit his candle and took the lead through the passages beneath King's Landing. When they came to a new one that was filled with many columns and a bit wider than what had been traversed so far, everyone could hear and feel a rhythmic shaking in the ground. What is that? Brienne asked. Arya took a guess. I think that's Cersei's army getting ready for war. Harry. It was a blessing to have clear skies today. That way, no dragons could hide in the clouds and catch them in a surprise attack. But it was so damn cold. Harry missed the heat of Essos. He could not wait to get back home to the warmth. First, he would find a nice whore and some damn good wine. But before any of that could happen, he had to lead his men to slay dragons and Dothraki. He sat mounted on his horse as he oversaw his men marching into formation through the streets of King's Landing. Many eyes of the common folk peered through the windows of their homes to watch what it was that woke them so early in the morning. The light of the sun was just barely touching the roofs of the buildings. The rumbling of soldiers was amplified when a dozen of the elephants, fully armored and armed, were being driven to battle. The beasts were fitted with a seat for the driver and a turret on the back that held 15 archers. Their tusks were fitted with blades that would cut through any horse ridden by Westerosi and Dothraki. They had lost a few elephants in Dorne, but Cersei was wise to put the care of the creatures as a top priority. These were the only beasts that would be able to fight off the Dothraki. Their horses were unaccustomed to the smell of elephants, and they would lose control. The Westerosi knights and savages have seen mammoths and giants, but they would tremble at the sight of creatures bred for war. Harry's peace of being alone was broken by the regular cunt who enjoyed intruding on him. Although, given the amount of noise made by the marching of the army and the annoying squawks coming from dozens of ravens flying overhead, there wasn't much peace and quiet at all. And so we march for war, Dario said as he halted his horse next to Harry's. If it was just the Dothraki, we'd win without a doubt. But there are knights and giants and dragons outside those walls. Doesn't it excite you at all? Harry looked straight ahead. I'll be excited when the dragons fall from the sky. Without them, the Targaryen have nothing. Without dragons, the Targaryens have an army 3 times the size of ours. Wars have been won against greater odds. Oh yes, different wars and different armies. Dario mocked. I wager all the gold we've been paid that half of the men on our side will run once they realize how far up the ass they've been fucked. You've never backed away from war, and neither have I. The only difference between them and the one that will happen today is that this one will never, ever be forgotten. We will never be forgotten. Everyone after us will just be piss in the snow. Dario chuckled to himself and kicked his heels into the sides of his horse to join up with his second sons. Harry sighed out and waited for the next battalion of his men to come by and joined them. When they did, he noticed many gazes watching them all as the road out. Eyes of people peered through windows. They didn't mean anything to Harry, but the other eyes watching, the ones of ravens perched on the rooftops, it felt like the god of death was looking at him through them.
Harry followed behind Bloodbeard's personal guard.
The Ferrells, that crazy bastard, was upset when he was denied the chance to kill Jon Snow. Targaryen, whatever the fuck he called himself, in single combat. Many would-be kingslaying on the battlefield was a glorious thing to achieve, and now Bloodbeard would have contenders for that title. Even if the Targaryens won a single combat fight, there wasn't a chance in any hells that there would not be a battle. All these men did not gather just to watch two men fight and accept the surrender of the losing side. No, these men were all thirsty for blood, and there was no better place than King's Landing to get a taste of it. The army passed under the portcullis of the Gate of the Gods and emptied into the fields, past all the houses and buildings outside the city walls. Harry rode his horse to the front lines of his soldiers. One of his men took the reins of the horse as he dismounted, and then climbed atop his personal elephant, Gold Rush. The elephants were in front with 10 horsemen in between each of them, and the rest of his company was behind. He looked out to the fields before them and saw the Targaryen army assembling just as they were. Harry eyed all of his men. Golden Company. Harry drew his sword and raised it high. Beneath the gold, his men drew their weapons and raised them high as well. The bitter steel. You, John? Cersei's army had begun to chant and make thunderous noises. They were all beckoning to fight and lusting for blood to spill. Even though Cersei's men were displaying a grand fierceness and no sign of retreat despite the odds, their attempts of mental warfare were not fazing anyone. Brain's flock was already in the city, as planned. All they had to do was wait for the right moment to deliver their message and hope that the people would believe the truth. If they did, there wouldn't be a single chance that they would stay silent and orderly. Jon stood with Ghost at his side. Ser Davos and Ser Jorah were with them as well, at the front of the army. Jon was fully dressed in his Valyrian steel armor, and Wintersong was resting at his side. They all watched, almost entertained at what their enemies were doing. Well, Ser Davos said. They're bold at least. Bold now, Jorah agreed, but it won't match a dragon's roar. Jon chuckled. We'll make sure they know that. He turned to face his Kingsguard and advisor. No matter how this day ends, know that I have never been more honored to fight with you both. The honor is ours, your grace, Ser Jorah said. Jon knelt down to his direwolf and nuzzled his nose. Stay with Jorah. Got it, boy. Ghost gave no sign of an answer, but that was just him. Jon was glad to have gotten a direwolf and glad that he was able to come so far with him. He left his Kingsguard in hand and met with his dragons. Rhaegal and Lyaros waited patiently for Jon. He gave Lyaros a scratch under her chin before he mounted Rhaegal. Atop the dragon, Jon drew Wintersong and let its steel sing as he raised it high. It was time Cersei's army and all in King's Landing to hear that House Targaryen has returned to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Winter is here with fire and blood. All the thousands behind and around let their roars explode through the air and echoed down to the city. Fire and blood. Fire and blood. Ghost let out a great howl followed by Lyras and Rhaegal roaring out. Such a war cry would be remembered by every generation born after today. The Dothraki screamers cried out as they began their charge. They rode together in a tight formation and for the first time at a slower pace than their usual war speed. There were still spike pits they had to avoid, and even though Bran could point it out on a map, there was no way to mark the very land itself. They could only guess. A group of riders fell forwards into the snow. They and their horses were impaled by the first of many spikes. There were dozens of groups that suffered the same fate. It was a tragedy that they had to die before the battle even truly begun. The ones who didn't fall through found the safe paths and all began to follow after them. It was a tight squeeze, but they began to fan out back into a fast horde of deadly riders. The Westerosi heavy cavalry followed behind them, and all began to charge at great speeds, heading straight to Cersei's army. An enemy horn blasted across the battlefield, and Cersei's forces began their advance to meet the Dothraki. But instead of the long lances taking the lead like Bran said they would, the Golden Company's elephants were at the van, followed by many horses behind them. The Dothraki archers had begun firing their arrows while standing on their horses, a skill that amazed Jon every time he watched. The elephants were armored, as were the men riding them. A few Dothraki managed to kill the elephant drivers, but it did not stop the beasts from charging. The elephants had bladed weapons attached to their tusks and swung their heads when both forces met. Screams of war slowly turned into screams of death as the elephants tore through the Dothraki and Westerosi horses. It was looking like a one-sided fight, But this was just the beginning. Harry, any man without years of training would have fallen off Goldrush's back by now. The largest of the elephants was half the speed of a Dothraki steed, but 10 times worse and 10 times harder to ride. Together with 14 others, Harry rode in the tower platform mounted on Goldrush's back. It shook greatly, as much as a ship of Euron Greyjoy's fleet. But to the Golden Company it was a steady ride. Harry aimed his crossbow and shot true at Dothraki and Westeros. That made it past Goldrush's tusks as the beast bashed and cleaved through 10s of them with nothing to halt or slow him. Any riders that made it by without getting killed by tusk or bolt were met with lance and swords of the cavalry of both the Golden Company and the Long Lances. He was right, this battle would not be forgotten as long as there was someone left in the world who draws breath. "Brace," the driver called out. Harry turned his head and saw a herd of several mammoths charging together in an attack formation. They were unarmored and did not have any weapons on their tusks or troops on their backs. Their only advantage was the sheer size. All of them were as big as Goldrush, but this wouldn't be enough to stop the might of the war elephants. Harry and his men aligned and held onto each other strategically as both herds of beasts came together. Despite Harry's initial thoughts, the mammoths proved stronger than they looked. Goldrush was bashed in the left of his body by the lead mammoth and shoved aside. The platform took a beating, and one of the men was unlucky enough to be hit in the head by the mammoth's trunk. It was so hard that he fell and died as one could be. They broke past the line of elephants and began tearing through the cavalry. Harry shouted over to the driver, "Pursue the mammoths." Before the order could have been received, a large spear came from falling like absolutely nowhere and pierced through Goldrush's armor and killed him. The elephant collapsed, throwing everyone from the tower off and crushing the driver. Harry came down hard in the snow, but not enough to daze him. He got to his feet and drew his falchion. He backed away from the path of riders and took to cover behind his elephant's body with those that survived the fall as well. Only 10 did. Harry looked at Goldrush's wound and saw that it wasn't a spear that killed him. It was a giant fucking arrow, much like the ones fired from the scorpions. But the craftsmanship was wrong. This arrow wasn't made by a smith. It was made like a hunter's arrow. It was made by a fucking giant. Another giant's arrow sailed overhead and killed another one of the elephants. The men atop of it were not as lucky as Harry or the others. Back to the fight, Harry ordered, and his men drew their swords. "Beneath the gold. The bitter steel," they replied back in a war cry, and followed their captain out of cover to fight those that were unhorsed, but not dead. There were so many types of warriors to choose from. Dornish knights wielding spears, Dothraki dual-wielding araks, knights of the Westerlands who sided with Saraye instead of Cersei. The chaos of battle was waiting for Harry to jump into, and he gladly did. Both sides were beginning to launch ordnance. Catapults from within the city began throwing balls of wildfire into the battlefield, while the giants shot their enormous arrows from the hills where Sam commanded and guided their aim. But the battle was becoming thick now. It was time for the dragons to have their turn. Jon gripped tightly onto Rhaegal, and immediately both of the dragons took flight. The last of the cavalry was through the lines of spike traps. Rhaegal and Daenerys glided over the infantry, moving in to join the battle. They began climbing higher into the air. As the elevation of the land lowered, there was a perfect spot with Cersei's forces moving to fight. The dragons banked to fly to it and awaited Jon's command. Dracarys, Rhaegal, and Daenerys unleashed their flames below, and dozens of screams filled the air. It became 100 and then hundreds as the flames continued to flow down onto the field of battle. Jon kept his gaze at the city while it all happened, and could see the firing of many scorpion bolts at him and the dragons. He steered Rhaegal to dodge as the bolts came. One of them grazed Rhaegal's neck, but the rest had missed. But there were only a dozen or so that were shot, and there were plenty more aimed at them. With one pass done, the dragons flew away from the city, keeping out of range of Cersei's weapons. Jon looked down to the battlefield and studied his next move. A group of the elephants had broken off and joined a great many men to make a charge and tear through Jon's army. It would deal a heavy blow and kill many, but not if Jon got there first. The dragons swooped down to those that would share the fate of their first victims. It was going to be within range, but they had to take that risk. Draka, Jon didn't have time to give the command. The next volley of bolts was shot. These ones were in greater number and spread out more. He held on tightly as Rhaegal turned sharply to evade the incoming projectiles. His efforts were not as great as the first time. A bolt pierced his tail close to his body. But that wasn't the worst of it. One of the bolts that Rhaegal did manage to evade found a new mark. Lyaros was stuck in her belly and cried out in such great pain. Her wings lost the grip of the air, and she fell out of the sky. They were low to ground already, but it didn't make her impact look any less terrifying. She crashed hard in the midst of the battlefield, creating a trail of dirt and snow where her body slid before stopping next to a small rise in the land untouched by the battle. Jon couldn't take his eyes away from his dragon, his last daughter. She wasn't moving, not a muscle. He couldn't contain himself. He yelled out the pain of his heart after watching the last of his daughters fall before his eyes. Rage replaced his misery, and he turned his gaze back to what should have already been engulfed in flames. He hardly had any control over Rhaegal when the dragon flew down for a second attempt. Again, bolts were fired, but Rhaegal merely flew faster to avoid them. None of the bolts found their mark, and Rhaegal wouldn't change course as the next wave took aim. Fire rained down on the Golden Company's elephants and their soldiers. Not as many as before were set aflame, but enough that their plan of attack was thwarted. But Rhaegal's fire ended when a second bolt pierced his body. This time it was in the right shoulder. A third found its way into his torso. Rhaegal cried out and bled heavily over the battlefield, but refused to fall. "Rhaegal, fly away," Jon begged, but Rhaegal wouldn't listen. His dragon unleashed his fires again over more of Cersei's sellswords, but only after a few seconds did he finally give in to the pain and crashed into the battlefield. "Arya, how many do you count?" Jaime asked. Arya peeked around the corner as carefully as she could, searching for as many guards that she could see in the torchlight. Even with the turncloaks, they were outnumbered by 2. The men in Lancaster Red stood vigil to the entrance of the main wildfire cache. Each of them was armed with a spear and a shield, and swords at their sides. Arya pulled her head from around the corner. 16. Too many, she whispered. If they went in charging head-on, they would meet a solid defensive wall and fail. There was no direction to surprise them at all. This wasn't going to be easy. "Anyone have any ideas?" Duck whispered. Before anyone could give an answer, 2 of Duck's men ran past them all out in the open, unarmed and in clear view of the Lannister men. Arya peered around the corner again and watched what they did. One of the men scooped up some dirt and flung it at the Lancen men, who took a defensive stance. "You pigs will burn in the 7 hells while I fuck your wives." "Your queen's a whore who sucks Walder Frey's rotting cock," the other mocked. Both of the men made their taunts as obnoxious as they could, and then took off running, when one of the Lancaster guards threw a spear at them and missed. "Get after them!" the man in charge shouted. 6 men took into a chase after the 2. Arya turned back and looked at everyone behind her. "Now there's only 10. "That's enough," Sandor said as he raised Heartsbane, and made for the rest. Arya drew Needle and her Valyrian dagger and followed him along with Jaime and Brienne. The Lannister men were still focused on watching where the 2 distractors had been chased off so that they did not notice Sandor coming from behind until he let out a loud growl. They all turned around just as the blade of Heartsbane cut through 3 necks at once, decapitating the men. Arya dodged under a spear, and with a quick swipe with Needle she slit the throat of the man attacking her. She quickly turned around and threw her dagger, and it landed at the neck of another guard. "Come back! We're under a T!" The guard didn't even finish his sentence when Brienne cut through him with Oathkeeper. The clanging of steel echoed through the cellars and hallways of King's Landing. Duck and the rest of his men joined the fight and scavenged what they could from the fallen, but by the time they did, the 10 Lancer guards were already dead, and the 6 who left had returned. 3 of the spears the Lancer men carried were stained with blood. One of the soldiers saw the mess and ran off, not of panic but alarm. He did not get very far after a spear was thrown into his back. "Do not let them escape," Duck ordered. He raised a shield with his men and chased after the Lannister guards. Sandor did the incredible and hurled Heartsbane at the 6. The throw was so powerful that Heartsbane chopped into one of the Lannister guards' shoulders and dug all the way into the middle of his chest. The remaining 4 were finished off, easily, but not before they managed to take 1 more of Duck's men with them. Arya sheathed Needle, retrieved her dagger, and followed Jaime to the door the Lannister men were guarding. He pulled the iron bar that kept it closed off and opened it. When they peered inside, they saw more wildfire than anywhere else. They had been. There must have been over 200 barrels, all of them leaking the green sludge of wildfire. This will destroy the entire Red Keep. Jaime said aghast, his face white as a sheet. Duck and 2 of his men came from behind. We'll never get it out of here in time, Duck said. No, but you can find how it connects to the rest of the wildfire under the city. Then just sever the connection, Jaime said, turning around. We'll do what we can as fast as we can. You do the same and make sure no one gets even a spark near this door. Duck rolled his eyes and shook his head at Jaime. Fucking Lancesters. Come on, we don't have time. Duck and 5 of his men shoved past Jaime and Arya and descended down the stairs that led into the room. Their only light was that of the green of the wildfire. The remaining 2 of the Golden Company, Turncloak, stood guard while Arya and the others proceeded to infiltrate the Red Keep. They followed the only passageway and soon passed the bodies of the 2 men who gave their lives to distract the Lancer guards. Arya drew needle when they came to a stairwell illuminated by daylight pouring in through a small window. Jaime took the lead and led them up to the stairs and throughout the lower levels of the Red Keep. Eventually, they came through a door that led to the main level of the castle. The entire place felt barren, where there was once a flock of perfumed nobles everywhere. One looked, there was no one. This way, Jaime spoke softly. Arya did not remember much of where she was from her time living here. It had been so long since those days, and she was more focused on where to find Septon and her father rather than where to find Cersei Lannister. Things began to become familiar shortly. Soon though, especially when they came to the large doors leading to the throne room. Sandor pushed them open slowly and peered through. Oh, fuck. He pushed the door open the rest of the way and revealed the inside. Cersei was glaring down at them from the Iron Throne. The mountains stood at her right and her Queensguard down the steps in front. Along with them were several others. They stood like statues and almost felt dead, similar to how the mountain was. Only the Queensguard had their weapons drawn. When I heard you were not with your bastard king, I suspected you would be coming for me, Cersei said. Her eyes were fixed on Jaime. Arya scoffed at the bitch. I would have been here sooner, had I not been distracted. Better late than never, she responded with a casual shrug. Cersei smirked as she switched focus to Arya, the little wolf come to avenge her traitor daddy, with a cow knight and gimpy dog. She stood from the throne and walked away from them all. Leave my brother alive, kill the rest. The Mountain and other soldiers all drew their weapons and kept their focus on everyone except Jaime. Arya raised needle and stood side-face, waiting for the first who dared to challenge her. Jon. Every roar he gave fueled his will to fight. Jon killed man after man who came to try and put an end to Rhaegal's life, and his Jon would not let anyone pass. No matter who came, Rhaegal was barely alive. He wouldn't let another one of the last dragons be killed. He wouldn't fail Dany again. Jon clashed Wintersong with a septon, and at the same time he darted his head to the side from a spear that nearly cut him. Jon grabbed the spear by the shaft and used it to push back both his attackers, men from the Company of the Rose. He countered the septon tire with a riposte, and drove his sword into the man's neck, enough to it was fatal and crippling, and then quickly carried the spear once again. This time he allowed the spear to strike against his armor. The tip bent and slid to the side, while the Valyrian steel wasn't even scratched. Jon grabbed hold of the spear again and trapped it before stabbing the last man, piercing his boiled leather easily. Both bodies fell, but more men were coming. It was like they in waves, giving Jon only a few seconds of respite. More were coming this time, far more. Jon was lucky enough that Rhaegal landed where the fighting was thinned, but it wouldn't be that way for long. The enemy troops were growing in number, and all of them were coming for him. Jon heard a rustling behind him, and turned around to see Rhaegal, pulling together the last bit of strength he could. The great dragon unleashed one last burst of fire. There were very few he hit, but the dragon created an uncrossable wall of flames, keeping all away for now. That was it. However, Rhaegal collapsed, and his eyes slowly shut. Jon furiously cut down the only man who was already past the wall of fire before going to his dragon. He removed his glove, and laid his bare hand over Rhaegal's snout, hoping to feel anything from the touch. A subtle breath, a great pulse of the dragon's heart, anything. A great many war cries took his attention away from Rhaegal, and Jon could see a battalion of his men gathering and engaging those who were waiting to cross the flames when it died down enough. Given that there was nothing proper to fuel the flames, it wouldn't be long until that was possible. Jon wasn't going to do anything while others fought. He put his glove back and gripped Wintersong tightly as he ran for the thinnest part of the firewall and leaped through the flames, his skin untouched and unburned. He picked up one of the Unsullied's round shields that were no longer in use and led his men in a counterattack. It was all so chaotic, there was no indication of which side was taking the advantage. Every time Jon made a kill, there were 3 more waiting for him and his men. The sounds of clashing steel and bashing shields were joined by feral growling. Ghost leaped past Jon and sank his teeth into the throat of a rather large man. From behind, Ser Jorah and a group of Northmen and Dothraki were charging on horseback, to the king. Ser Jorah yelled with his sword raised. The Dothraki were screaming their war cries as their swords swung down and cut every man in their path. One of the elephants of the Golden Company was on its way to them all, and was already swinging its great tusks at the Dothraki screamers. It sent horses into the air, and wasn't slowing down. Jon could see Ser Jorah jump from his horse before it was struck by the elephant. Jon raised his sword and shouted as loud as he could, "Bring down the beast!" He charged forward with Ghost at his side and his fighters behind him. He howled a war cry as the remaining mounted riders galloped past them all to fend off the elephant. They avoided its path completely and circled around, but the archers on top were picking them off a few riders at a time. Jon's force broke through a shield wall that was not fortified in time. There were so many different men in different armor, it was becoming hard to tell who was an ally and who was an enemy. A great roar came from the elephant when a Dothraki screamer had leaped from his horse and stuck the pointy end of his arak into one of the elephant's eyes. It pained the beast greatly, and it collapsed. It was swarmed by men and killed by many, and those that rose it were slaughtered. Blood sprayed onto Jon's face from a freshly opened neck, but he continued to fight. The screams of war and pain were becoming mulled in all the sound. Harry. And now the battle was truly starting to turn in their favor. Watching the first dragon fall was pleasing, but watching the second with Jon Snow on it falling from the sky after 3 skewers was absolutely ecstatic. Now the head of the Targaryen army was baring its neck to be cut off. Harry took hold of his war horn and gave 3 quick but loud blasts, signaling his men to change the focus of their attack. He then seized a horse from one of his men and joined in an all-out charge to the so-called king. The other sellswords companies knew of this maneuver and joined them while others foolishly continued to keep fighting, where they could merely shed easy blood. They had to detour around the fields, covered with wildfire that continued to burn and roast all who were out of luck with fate to be touched by the stuff. Both allies and enemies burned and their scents filled the air. Despite the horrid smell, it was better than the shit of King's Landing. Once there, Harry didn't hesitate to cut down any soldier that got in his path. He swung down his falchion left and right, taking off heads and arms with the sharp edge of his blade that could match Valyrian steel. He wanted Blackfyre back, and he was going to get it. There were a number of Northerners making a defensive stand on a small rise in the land. In order to get to Jon Snow, Harry was going to have to get through them. First, "Lances, take the van," Harry shouted out it. All the cavalry who had spears or lances rode ahead and formed 2 lines, leading the rest of the attack to cut through the northern defense. The northern fools saw this and became intimated to the point of retreat. They turned tail and began to run back to the other side of the hill. "No escape!" Harry ordered. "Kill every last one of them." He spurred his horse to go faster, as did a few others. They were the closest to the head of the charge now, behind the lines of lances and spears. When they would get on the other side of the hill, it would be over for the Northmen now that they had given up the high ground. But when they all got over the hill, it wasn't just Northmen staring them down in much greater numbers and formation, but also a pair of golden eyes belonging to the blue dragon that should have been dead. Harry pulled back on the reins of his horse, as hard as he could. But he couldn't give an order of retreat, for the last thing he saw was the dragon's mouth open, and a fury of fire burst forth, engulfing them all. "Jon!" A ball of wildfire landed close by, almost too close. The green flames consumed both some of Jon's men and the sellswords. Jorah was pushed to the ground by the sheer force of the explosion. As he got back to his feet, Jon defended him from a man yelling out from atop a white and black striped horse while swinging a sword at them. Jon parried the blade and even managed to nick the man's neck enough that he fell from his mount after bleeding out. Ghost lunged at the striped horse and killed it mercilessly. His fur all across his mane was stained with sprays of blood from all of his kills, and his lips were even more so red. Jorah roared out like a bear as the sellswords were attacking in greater numbers. Savage men with tattoos of cats came rushing at them all. Jon parried the blade of a sword with his gauntlet, but had not even a second to kill the wielder. He jumped back when an axe came down. It missed his head, but only barely. Jon clashed steel with both men, tearing through a gorget of the axe wielder and cracking the sword of the other. He knocked the blade of the man's hand before Ghost pounced on him and finished the job. Jon rushed to join Jorah. They were almost as separated as they were from their men, and it was not good. Jorah took a mace to his helm and fell back, dazed and disoriented. But he didn't let that be the death of him. Like a drunkard, Jorah fumbled to dodge whatever came at him. He managed elbowed his attacker in the face before proceeding to stab his sword through him next. After that, he tore off his helmet with great effort. Though he lived from the mace hit in his head, he was bleeding from above his temple, blinding his right eye. But this was no time to rest or find pain and injuries. There was still more coming for them, and not enough of the Targaryen army was stopping them. It was only Ser Jorah and Drawd and Ghost. Wintersong's blade rang out as it cut through the air, and snow to stop a Septonider from killing Jorah. Jon roared out as he fought with a man in golden armor, while Jorah stood with him to defend against another. Jon took an opportunity when he locked blades to grab the Septonider by the end, and slide his sword and slash his enemy's neck. He turned before the body hit the ground dead and was gladdened that Jorah defeated his attacker. Jon and Jorah looked over to a pair of men marching through the battle with soldiers in armor, decorated with a feral cat. They recognized both of the leaders. The tall one with the red beard was Bloodbeard and his personal guard, the ferals. He carried a vicious-looking double-sided war axe, stained with much blood. The other captain, dressed in rugged armor, was Daario Naharis, who was smirking greatly. Bloodbeard advanced, shoving some of his own men aside, and pointed to Jon. "Bring me his head. I'm gonna drink your direwolf's blood from your own armor." Jon saw two of the ferals switch the grip on their spears to throw them, each aiming one at Jon or Jorah. In an instant, Jon rushed to stand in front of Jorah when the spears were thrown. The one aimed for him missed, but the other meant for Jorah hit hard on Jon's Valyrian steel armor, as he acted as a shield to protect his Kingsguard. The steel spearhead was bent and cracked, while Jon's armor didn't even have a scratch. "I want that armor!" Bloodbeard roared out. Ghost barked out as he ran out on his own. "Ghost? No," Jon called out, but it was ignored. Even though he wasn't warging into his wolf, he could feel the raging Ghost felt from seeing his companion attacked. The white direwolf went to lunge at Bloodbeard and sank his teeth into a steel gauntlet, biting through the metal. Jon rushed forward with Jorah to go fight with his wolf. Bloodbeard growled as Ghost thrashed, and with great strength, he was able to throw him off. Jon and Jorah were intercepted by two axe-wielding ferals and fought as hard as they could to get past them. Two of Bloodbeard's guards circled around Ghost and thrust their spears at him. One pierced at Ghost's hind leg, and Ghost whimpered out before suddenly ravaging the feral who attacked him. But while he did that, the other drove his spear into Ghost's neck. Jon let out a cry when he felt a great pain in his heart. He was holding back the feral he fought as he watched his greatest friend fall before him. The blood stained the white fur, and the life in the red eyes had faded. Jon yelled out and headbutted his opponent, following it with dismembering the feral's right arm, and then shoving Wintersong deep into the bastard's chest. "I'll do it myself," Bloodbeard bellowed. He and his men ran forward with their weapons raised, but he suddenly arched forward. His body went limp as he fell to the ground like a wet rag. When he landed, everyone saw a knife with a hilt of a naked woman stuck in the back of his head. All eyes turned to Daario, who had just thrown it with a smirk. "Are you gonna fight, or just watch?" He was attacked by two of Bloodbeard's men, and fought with his Eric, while Jon and Jorah took care of the others. When Daario killed one and shoved the other to the ground, he blew a horn he had at his side. The blast was higher pitched than any other horn and loud enough to be heard all around. Daario then killed the second man with ease. "What did you just do?" Jon yelled out as Wintersong shattered the blade of a septentar, and then took the head of the man who held his bladeless hilt with a dumbfounded look. The second sons fight for House Targaryen. Arya had no time to pull her dagger free from one of Cersei's zombified soldiers. The thing was dead, but another, the last of them besides the mountain, nearly took her arm off. She parried his sword away, but was butted in the head by his elbow. She fell back on the floor, her head banging with pain. Despite that, she still felt the sting of the cut on her sword arm she got from one of the Queen's Guard. Brienne stepped in time and used Oathkeeper to take the beast's head off. Only 3 of the Queen's Guard remained. Knights that no one would remember or care to. She was showing more resilience to the wounds she received, better than anyone. One of the zombified men broke her leg and she had multiple gashes on her sword arm. But she was at the end of her rope. She fell to her knees and leaned on her sword for support. All of them were covered in sweat and blood. Arya stepped in front of Brienne to defend her. She killed the shortest one quickly by deflecting his sword and sticking him in his head with the pointy end of needle. The Valyrian steel came out cleanly as she helped sword Ferrex fight the man he was losing against. All the while Sandor stood across from his brother, face stained with the blood of 4 men in Heartsbane, just as dirty. The mountain hadn't done anything at all. It was like he was waiting for Sandor to be all this as well. Come on, you fucker. Sandor raised Heartsbane up and the mountain did the same with his sword. They charged at each other, Sandor bellowing out a great war cry while the mountain remained silent as the grave. Their swords rang like septa bells and echoed throughout the throne room. Sandor was pushed back by the mountain's strength. He stood his ground though. He snarled and growled like hounds of his family's sigil with each swing of his sword. Jaime was the only one who had not a single worry of being killed. There was hardly a scratch on his, since Cersei ordered him to be taken alive. No doubt Cersei wanted to have him back by her side, or rather, inside her. He took a fist to the temple, trying to defend Brienne, but his pain gave her the opening to lunge, although it was rather a limp. Forward with Oathkeeper and kill another of the Queen's Guard. Arya bobbed and weaved like a flowing river, as she dodged every thrust and swing of the sword that missed her every time. She finally caught the blade with needle and returned with a riposte, driving the pointy end into the knight's thigh between the gaps in his armor. He fell to one knee before falling to the ground after needle cut across his throat in a quick strike. Sandor roared out as he swung Heartsbane to meet the mountain's sword. His strength had to be the greatest in the world at that moment, for when the edges met, Heartsbane cut through the steel and at the same time tore the blade out of the mountain's hand. He followed it by thrusting Heartsbane in the mountain's chest, plunging it deep. But that didn't end it. It didn't even look like it was noticed. The mountain wrapped his hands around Sandor's neck and began to squeeze tightly. Sandor began gagging and struggled to break free of his brother's grip. Jaime used this chance to save him, and swung Widow's Wail down at the mountain, cutting off his right arm and freeing Sandor, who pulled Heartsbane free, and in one giant slash decapitated the mountain. The head fell hard like a boulder and cracked the stone floor, where it landed. Sandor coughed and heaved for air, as Arya killed the last of Cersei's men. This was not like any fight she ever been in. She was exhausted, more so than when she fought against the dead. She had to catch her breath, was both tired and starving, but it was almost over. She had to rush over to Brienne, who was moaning in pain, as she collapsed. Her last attack damaged her broken leg more than it already was. Arya did her best to get Brienne into a comfortable position as Jaime rushed over to help them. Easy, easy, Jaime said, as he helped pull Brienne to sit up against one of the pillars. How bad does it hurt? Brienne groaned, before answering. Worse than the fucking bear. I suppose this is the end for me. Don't say that, Jaime hissed at her. If you can survive a bear and the army of the dead, you can damn well survive this. Brienne cracked a smile at him. I meant the end of the journey. I won't make it up the stairs like this. You go on. You have to end this. We're not leaving you here alone, Arya insisted. Don't worry about me. There may be more ahead. I'll just get in the way. Now go. You're wasting time. Arya looked at Jaime, seeing that he didn't want to leave either. But Brienne was right. They were wasting time and they needed to end this before it was too late. I'm coming back for you, Jaime told her. I promise. Brienne looked at him strangely. Just go already, golden child. Jaime nodded with a smirk, and together with Arya and Sandor, they left the throne room and raced after Cersei. They climbed the steps leading to the Queen's room, meeting no opposition to stop them. When they reached the hallway, they saw Cersei's hand, that man called Qhoburn, exiting the door of the Queen's chambers. He became wide-eyed when he saw Arya drawing her Valyrian dagger. He didn't have time to run because of Arya's speed and throw too fast. The dagger sang through the air before piercing the side of Qhoburn's neck. That wasn't necessary, Jaime said as the body fell limply and stained the floor in blood. I don't care, Arya said, without a trace of regret or remorse in her voice. She led the way until finally they were standing outside the door of the room. Arya pushed it open and had Needle at the ready in case there were any last guards. Surprisingly, there were none. The only guards were those in the throne room. Arya slowly stepped inside, scanning for any form of trap or trick. But there were none. They all crossed over the map of Westeros, painted over the floor and into the bedroom. There they saw Cersei sitting quietly by the windowsill, smirking as she looked to the outside, and drinking wine from a crystal chalice. On the windowsill by itself was a single candle with a green flame burning. A breeze would come and go, but it was not enough to extinguish the flame. Cersei set her chalice down and turned to look at them. Everything I did was for our children. Jaime, every sacrifice I made, everybody lying dead at my order, every war waged has been for our children. But here you are, fighting for the ones that took them away from us. Jaime spoke calmly but harshly. Everything you did was for you. You couldn't let go of your crown to the Tyrells, and you can't do it now. Your reign is over. She smirked at her brother. So this is how it ends. With my brother's blade against my skin. You're going to kill the woman who loves you like none in existence ever could hope to match. Euron shook his head. Obsession isn't love, it's madness. But I won't kill you. I can't. All eyes turned to Jaime, surprised at his words. He looked at Arya with a gaze that spoke to her and offered the handle of Widow's Wail to her. Euron's eyes met Arya's, and something unspoken passed between them. That was when she understood what he was asking of her and ordering her to do. Arya sheathed Needle and took the sword made from her father's. She never once held ice or touched it, but in her hands she felt a familiarity of its presence. Sandor walked to Cersei and seized her. She began to fight back, trying to get free of his grip on her arm. Let go of me, dog. I will not be killed by Ned Stark's little wolf bitch. I am a lion of the rock. I am the queen. Sandor forced Cersei to her knees as Jaime turned and walked to leave the room. Before exiting the door, he pulled off his golden hand and threw it aside, leaving it behind. Arya had no complaints or objection that he should stay. On the contrary, a small part of her felt sympathy for him, but she put that thought aside as she gripped Widow's Wail tightly in both hands and locked eyes with Cersei. Don't worry, I've decided to show you mercy. The same mercy your mad bastard gave my father. Cersei struggled as Arya lifted the Valyrian sword and aligned it with Cersei's neck. With one swing, she yelled out and ended the reign of Cersei Lannister, the Mad Queen of Westeros. Jon! Another ball of wildfire came from above and exploded nearby. This one was not close enough that anyone had to worry. What Jon had to worry about were the several men he had to fend off with Jorah. They were distanced apart, but each of them was holding their own against the odds. Daario had his own problems to solve. He was up against a man almost as big as the Hound. But as they fought, the bombardments had suddenly ceased. Aside from the giants firing arrows at the scorpions on the walls and rooftops of the city, the wildfire and scorpion bolts had ceased. Overhead, a great flock of ravens flew, squawking out into the air. It was Bran's flock. Their plan to rile the citizens worked. Now the people of King's Landing knew what it was they were really eating, and weren't standing back quietly. The riots of King's Landing were doing just what they needed. Jon parried an axe swing and came from behind the wielder. He wrapped an arm around the man's head and with a strong pull broke the man's neck. Jorah sent the last of them to the ground and stabbed his sword deep into him. Cersei's army was still relentless and not giving up, but kept doing everything they could to push through and fight hard. Jon and Jorah took what moments they could to catch their breaths. A great roar suddenly erupted throughout the battlefield. It came from the northeast. Jon looked up and saw the shadow of the greatest dragon alive diving down to the battlefield and ignited the fields in great flames. Daenerys had come to join the fight instead of staying at Winterfell. It gladdened Jon to see her here. While he wished she stayed with their children, he felt she deserved, needed to fight with everyone. The ground shook when Drogon's flaming impacted and burned all the unlucky souls who were in his path. "I didn't think she'd be here," Daario said as he retrieved his dagger from Bloodbeard's head. "I'll have to be quick then." Without any given indication or warning, Jon felt himself get shoved to the side by Jorah as Daario's dagger cut at him. He felt the blade embed itself in his arm between the gaps of his armor. He cried out as he grasped his wound and looked over to Daario, who was twirling his arake in his hand. "When you're dead, nothing will be between me and my queen." He spoke loudly above the sounds of battle. "And with so much death, no one will know who actually killed you." Jorah pushed himself in front of Jon and protected him. "It won't happen as long as I'm alive," the Bear Knight said adamantly, with his sword pointed at Daario. The treacherous sellsword smirked at him and shook his head. "Why protect him? If he's dead, there's no doubt our queen will finally look to you for love. Isn't that everything you've ever wanted?" "More than anything in the world," Jorah replied, but he didn't take his eyes off Daario. "And yet here you stand in my way." "Aye, here I stand." Daario shook his head as he chuckled. "Come on, old man, don't make me be a piece of shit now." "You never weren't one," Jorah countered. Jon pulled the knife out and threw it aside as he raised Wintersong to join Jorah. His left arm tensed at the pain and weakened his strength, but his right arm was perfectly fine. Daario broke into a quick charge at both of them and moved quickly. Jorah fought as Jon's vanguard, while Jon moved to take Daario off guard. Daario proved to be much faster than he let on, as he slashed his arrow at Jon after easily parrying Jorah away from him. Jon noticed that he was hardly exhausted and wasn't covered in other men's blood like he was. While they fought Bloodbeard's men and every other damned sellsword, Daario probably did hardly a thing. He's been waiting for this, planning it. Jorah landed a punch square onto Daario's face, and it knocked him on his ass. Daario scrambled to his feet and took a dagger from the sword belt of a fallen Northman. He dual-wielded both weapons as both Jon and Jorah attacked him at once. Daario held his own though. His fighting wasn't like anything Jon faced before. The closest to it was like how Carl Tanner fought with his knives, quick and devilish. Daario pushed both of them back and grinned pompously at both of them. "Is this all you have to offer, bastard? I thought you were the greatest swordsman alive." Jon wasn't one to get riled by such taunts, but he did feel upset at himself. He fought and beat the bloody Night King. Why was this proving to be just as difficult? He joined Jorah in a 2-on-1 attack. It was interrupted when a wave of sellswords rushed them all and the Targaryen forces did the same to meet them. Jon was pushed and shoved. He became separated from Jorah and Daario, cut off by a river of soldiers. He was now faced with Cersei's army. Injured and away from the fight, he needed to finish. He fought tooth and nail to get through anyone who got his way. He couldn't let his Kingsguard fight alone, fight someone bent on killing him. Yet Jorah was fighting Daario alone. He had skill, but Daario had more energy in him. Jon did everything he could to push through when he saw Jorah disarmed of his sword, and had nothing to defend himself from Daario's arakak. Anxiety filled him as he could only watch his Kingsguard in battle. He couldn't let others fight to protect him, and not be willing to protect them back. Instead of running, Jorah let the blade strike his armor, and then trapped it with his arm. The sickle-like curve wrapped around Jorah's breastplate and clung to it like a fishhook. Daario tried to pull free, but failed, and Jorah began to beat him using his bare hands as his weapons. Daario's pretty face was turning red from blood. But Daario parried Jorah's punch with his free hand and held his dagger like was a claw protruding from his knuckles. With a single jab, he pierced the blade through a weak point in Jorah's armor and stuck it deep. Jorah became frozen as the dagger dug deeper. He kept standing even when Daario freed his arak from Jorah's grip and pushed him to the side. Only then did he fall to his knee. Jon let out a great howl of fury and finally pushed free of the fighting around him. He could feel a resonance coming from his sword. With every swing, Wintersong's blade would sing as it cut through the air and clashed with the blackened steel of Daario's arak. The soldiers around them dared not get close, either for fear of getting killed or determination to let no one interferes. Daario moved so well that it almost tore Wintersong out of Jon's hands. But the weapon was a rock, only 2/3 the length of Jon's sword. Jon backed away and kept Daario at a distance that he could be reached. But Daario was clever and skilled. He swooped low like a bird, grabbing its prey and almost cutting into Jon's knee, but was blocked by Wintersong. That was just so he could trap the sword itself. He headbutted Jon and tripped him onto his back. Jon yelled out and let his anger spark his will to fight. He was putting Daario on the defensive. Despite his attempts to look confident and smug, Daario was beginning to crack and become nervous. Jon kicked Daario hard in the chest, sending him back a few steps before he raised Wintersong and brought it down with all his strength. Daario was able to put his arc in Wintersong's path, but the Valyrian steel cut through it with ease and continued to go through the flesh that was in its path. Daario's arm was cut cleanly off and he began screaming out and grabbed at the blood-spilling wound. He fell to his knees while Jon tightened his grip on Wintersong, but it loosened when he saw Darius coming their way. The ground shook heavily, and a gust of wind rushed by as Drogon landed in their field of battle. Soldiers moved away from his path, and many of them cheered out. The great black dragon eyed Daario as Daenerys peeked her head into view and saw the state of her former lover. She looked at Jon, saw the look her husband gave to Jorah, and that was all she needed to see. Her face changed instantaneously from battle-hardened to heartbroken. Daenerys, Daario cried out in a plea. Jon locked eyes with his wife, and they both knew what he deserved. Daenerys showed not a single amount of affection in her eyes. She only muttered a single word when she looked back at her former lover, Dracarys. No, Daario's screams became muffled by the roaring flames that consumed him. Given the force of Drogon's fire, it was mere seconds before the lonely sellsword was turned into ash. Daenerys climbed down from Drogon and ran with Jon over to Jorah. He was gasping for air as they both fell to their knees at him. Daenerys was stricken with grief and tears as she held the bare knight in her arms. No, 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 she wept. Jon could only watch and be with her as she did. Please, you can't die. Khaleesi, Jorah rasped out. Khaleesi. He reached his hand up, but it fell. Before Daenerys could take hold of it. Khaleesi. He took one final breath, and slowly his life left him. Daenerys cried as she held Jorah close to her. Jon felt a guilt befall him he did not expect. He failed to protect his Lord Commander Jorah from mutineers, and he couldn't protect Jorah either. Jon put his arms around his wife and held her as she held her dearest friend and wept for him. He looked all around and could see that the sellsword armies were now in full retreat. They were breaking for the shores north of the battle. What he didn't expect was to see balls of fire rain down on them. They came from the fleet of Greyjoy ships sailing in. Rowboats, with hundreds of Ironborn, were coming ashore to cut off any escape, as the Dothraki came from behind. It's over, Dany, it's over. But Jon quickly realized he was dead wrong when a sudden rumble shook the ground and a loud boom coming from the city echoed to the battlefield. Arya, Widow's Wail fulfilled its purpose for Arya, so she no longer had need of it. She walked out of the room, finding Abe just outside in the hall. Silently, she returned the Valyrian steel to Lannister, and together with Sandor, they made their way back. The throne room. They were all exhausted, and finally able to rest. At long last, the wars for the Iron Throne were over. All who died for it have been avenged from the stupidity and evil of one woman who was beyond addicted to power. All who suffered would hopefully find peace, as would the realm. By tomorrow, the world would finally change for the better. When they got to the throne room, Jaime ran over to assist Brienne, who shared a look of sympathy with him. Arya stood next to the Iron Throne just to look at the damn thing. All the death, her family, her friends, everyone. It was just for a chair of swords. A hideous thing that so many have killed and lied to obtain. She couldn't see Jon or Daenerys sitting on it to rule. It just didn't feel right. Arya left the chair to join the others, but the sudden and instant shake of the ground halted her steps. A low rumble turned into a roar of an explosion. The light outside the windows turned green and the entire throne room shook tremendously. Looking through one of the windows, Arya saw the base of the Tower of the Hand explode in the green flames of wildfire, destroying the bottom. The rest of it began to crumble down, falling directly over the throne room. "Run!" Arya shouted, as she ran as fast as her feet could carry her, but it would be in vain. The roof collapsed when the tower hit it and the entire room shook and crumbled. Arya was thrown off balance and tripped on one of the dead bodies. The falling pieces of the roof missed her, but the collapsing pillar falling after her wouldn't. Arya, the last thing Arya felt before everything went dark was being shoved forward. When she got to her feet, the pillar boomed as it fell, and dust overtook the entire room. Arya coughed as her lungs began to search for clean air, and her eyes stung from the dust. It was thicker than any fog. The throne room continued to break apart and collapse as Maegor's holdfast began to erupt as well. She crawled as quick as she could through the debris, blinded by dust and not having a single idea where to go. But after the holdfast was destroyed and burning, there was no more. The rumbling stopped, as did the explosions. Cold winds began to blow the dust out and give clear air and vision of the throne room. The way they had come from killing Cersei, the roof, it was all gone. The Iron Throne was bent and destroyed from the great amount of stone that fell on it. Arya began to slow her breathing and tried to calm down from her panic. "Arya," Brienne called out. "Arya." "I'm here," she replied, hoping to all the gods that everyone was all right. Moments later, a shade of a figure in the remaining thickness of dust transformed into Sarai. "Arya, are you hurt?" She shook her head at him. "No, I'm fine." Shaime wrapped his arm around Arya and pulled her to her feet. "Is Brienne hurt?" "No more than she already was." Shaime looked around her. "Where's Clegane?" Arya caught her breath when she realized who it was who pushed her out of the way of the pillar. Meant to kill her. She looked back where she came from and could see a limp hand covered in dust and blood sticking out from beneath a pile of rubble. She rushed over to where it was, Shaime joining her immediately, and they both began to clear off what they could. The stone rubble wasn't large, yet it felt so heavy. It didn't take much time when they found the body underneath. Sandor's face was covered in blood, and his upper body was the only thing not crushed by the pillar. His eyes were closed by themselves, which was a mercy in some sense. He was gone. He gave his life to save hers. There was a part of Arya that wanted to feel a sense of justice for the murder of Micah, but it felt outweighed by losing another person who cared for her. For the first time in years, she felt the sting of tears on her cheeks. Sansa. It was such a beautiful winter's day. The snow was falling lightly all around, and it almost seemed like there wasn't a war going on. Sansa stood on the balconies surrounding the courtyard of Winterfell, and watched with Gilly next to her as some of the children were playing together. The fawn's son Theon, Ashara Dane, and little Sam had built a few snowmen down below, and were reenacting the battle at the wall. Ashara had her arms out pretending to be a dragon, and Theon was pretending to be Jon, and together they bashed one of their White Walkers into a pile of snow. Then little Sam came in with a little wooden stick, and pretended it was a bow so could shoot arrows at another one of their enemies. They all laughed together as they played. It reminded Sansa of the times when she was a little girl. She and Jatrid would have snowball fights with Robb and Jon. The boys always had harder throws, but the girls always outnumbered them. But as they got older, she became more distant and tried to be more like her mother. "The Septon," Bella called her boy from the courtyard. "You didn't eat lunch today." Even though Sansa didn't require it of her, Bella was working in the kitchens. She was the type of person who liked to keep themselves busy. She was a good woman and a good mother. "But Mama," Theon whined, "roots taste like mud." "No, they taste worse than mud." There was no argument from anyone, but none of the other children dared to agree in front of Theon's mother. Bella pinched him by the ear and dragged him away. "You'll eat your food and that's that." Her son attempted to free himself, but by the looks of it, her pinch was too much to fight off. Ashara waved goodbye, as did little Sam, both of whom looked sad that they lost a playmate, but glad it wasn't them being dragged off. Gilly giggled lightly at the scene. She had her hands rested at her stomach, that was starting to show its roundness. Yesterday before dinner, Sansa confided in her about what to expect during pregnancy, and it ended up with the reveal that Gilly had been with child before the armies had left. She never told anyone yet. In hopes of surprising Samwell, her thick clothes did most of the hiding, but now she didn't have much care for who knew and who didn't. She said that Sam would be just as happy when he found out. "I hope I have another boy. I think little Sam deserves a little brother." Gilly smiled as the Ashara and little Sam continued to play, toppling the White Walkers over in triumph. "What do you hope yours will be?" The question rocked Sansa a little. She still hadn't come to full terms with herself about the child. The worries of a bastard still outweighed the joys of having a child. "I don't know." Gilly took notice of Sansa's silence and worry. You don't look happy. Highborn women are looked at differently than highborn men when they have bastards. Sansa confessed. The easiest way to put it is that we're like milk that's spoiled. And raising a child in the eyes of the world we live in, it's still a bit terrifying for me. Gilly scoffed at her. That's not terrifying. It's stupid. Terrifying is when I had little Sam and thought my husband was going to take him away to the White Walkers. Terrifying is when you live in a world that's nothing but cold and praying to anyone who'll listen. That today wasn't the day your baby's life slipped away from you. She did not ease off from the differences of their views, and by all means was right. While Sansa was worrying about how to deal with the political fallout that would come at her and her child, Gilly had to once worry about merely how to survive long enough to see another tomorrow. You Southerners always overcomplicate things, Gilly said before leaving and taking little Sam with her inside the castle. This was a new side Sansa hadn't witnessed from Gilly. Granted, they rarely ever spoke, but Sansa always saw her as the shy type. Perhaps what she said broke Gilly out of her shell. Even though she was only a wildling, Gilly had a fair point. Was she really overcomplicating this? She didn't want to take another husband, so she had no worries of sullying herself. But she still had to represent her status of a lady. She was brought up to be a noble, not commoner, nor a whore. She couldn't think much longer since Ashura returned to her because there was no one else to play with. Did you have fun? We defeated the White Walkers, Ashura cheered. You certainly did. If they ever come again, I want you to make the battle plans. They won't stand a chance. Together with Ashura, Sansa went to the training yard to see to Rickon. They found him practicing sword fighting with a few of the other boys he befriended while they were at the wall. One of the older boys, probably 17 years old, was knighted after the attempted ambush on the castle. Both he and Rickon were sparing with live steel. Only Rickon used Valyrian steel instead of castle-forged steel like his opponent. This was the first time Sansa actually saw her little brother able to wield snow in a fight. His injuries from the Battle of the Bastards weighed on him, but now they did nothing to avert him from the strength he needed to use their family's new ancestral sword. Unfortunately, it still wasn't enough for him to win the match as the older boy parried Snow and had Rickon wide open to be stabbed. You lasted longer at least, he said with a smirk. Rickon rolled his eyes at him. That's enough for today, WrathofAvarice. Rickon emphasized with exaggeration. Victory, your turn. We'll use practice swords this time. He traded Snow for a tourney blade and saw Sansa waiting for him. He looked over to the other onlooking boys as WrathofAvarice began sparring with another boy who was probably his twin given their identical looks. Geralt, Rickon called. Come on now. Geraldine poked his head out from the crowd and waddled over to Rickon, but passed him ignorantly when he saw Sansa and immediately went to her instead. Have you been feeling better? Rickon asked as he approached his sister. She still hadn't told him about her pregnancy. While she was taking steps to improve her recovery of nausea and controlling her mood swings, she still had morning sickness regularly, categorically. Rickon merely shrugged, given that there was nothing he could really. I hope you feel better. I'll come by when I'm done here. Rickon returned to his training while Sansa took both Dane children by the hand and escorted them back into the castle. They went in Sansa's room, returning to Matthias and Aemon, who had both just woken from their naps. Ashura and Geralt climbed on Sansa's bed, while Sansa tended to the babes. She had a wet nurse come to feed and change them. After she left, Sansa watched over them all the while contemplating on her pregnancy. To her knowledge, there haven't been many highborn women with bastards aside from Cersei, of course. She once heard a rumor that Lady Barry Dustin had one when she was still Barry Riswell, but it was only just that, a rumor. Aegon the Unworthy had his consorts, and they gave him bastards. And that caused 5 rebellions. Sansa began to wonder about her child's life and hers as well. Jon promised her that there wouldn't be any political matches for gain. She didn't want to marry again, as a piece in the great game. Besides, now that she was pregnant with a bastard, what value did she have now? She was just a lady regent and advisor to Warden of the North. But once Rickon was wed and grown enough to rule on his own, what place would there be for her and her child? She was good at ruling. She liked it. She liked people coming to her for guidance and help, and she liked being able to solve their problems. It gave her purpose, rather than just sitting idly by like she had to at the wall during battle. Sorry I'm late, Rickon announced as he entered. His face was all sweaty from training. He undid his sword belt and leaned Snow against the nightstand. I feel like I could give Jon a run for his gold after that much work. What about Arya? Push, absolutely not. She'd be merciless against me. He went over to her and took Aemon from her arms, leaving her with Matthias. Speaking of girls, I've seen you lingering with Jonna and her sister more frequent in the last few days. Rickon's face reddened as he sat down. Through certain connections, Sansa learned of a marriage that almost happened between the Lord of Winterfell and a certain wildling girl. She wants me to teach her and her sister how to read and write. I'm sure Maester Wolkan will welcome them in lessons. No, she wants me to teach them. I'm not opposed, but I wouldn't know where to start. Maybe I should just let Maester Wolkan do it. If you want to, you can join them. Your penmanship does need work, after all. It's not that bad, he argued. No, but it needs to be better. Maybe if show Jonna your letters, she won't think it much of a challenge. There were actually many other wildling children living in Winterfell. Some were orphaned and the rest had their mothers or fathers, but what they all had in common was a lack of education in their new home. There were just as many adults with the same dilemma. Perhaps we should have a school built, not just for the children but the adults as well. Rickon silently thought about the idea and nodded in agreement. We wouldn't even need to build one. We can use one of the vacant cabins. We should outfit them to be proper homes, not just logs, but stone as well. When winter dies down, the work here will go faster. Faster? Maybe. Lesson? No. I'm still trying to figure out what to do about the Night's Watch. Lord Commander Tollett is keeping them busy, but many are still questioning what's the point of the Order anymore. With no wildlings or White Walkers to defend the realm from, what's their job? Not only that, but occupying empty castles isn't as easy as thought it would be. Whoever is given the rule of Lolny Steppes will be questioned to serve under the Umbers or the Icewoods. Kingsheard might as well be rebuilt completely. Whoever's made Lord of Queen's Crown will be handling the Night's Watch and how to get rid of the lakes surrounding the whole tower. Rickon sighed deeply and sank in his chair. Sansa had an idea. I'll do it. Do what? Queen's Crown. You need someone you trust and rely on to settle this. I can become lady and deal with the Night's Watch. But it's a lone tower in the middle of a lake, hardly fit for a Stark. You said yourself, you are being overwhelmed, and now that I'm offering to help you're refusing, because you deserve more than just a tower and a broken village. I mean someplace better and fit for a queen. What is broken can be fixed and made better than before. With no wilding raids, the people who settle will be able to live peacefully. It's high time House Stark branched out in the north, and the tower itself is called Queen's Crown. This is something I want to do. Are you sure? It's not Winterfell though. I mean, it's just a tower, and you'll be alone up there. Believe me, a lone tower is far better than Red Keep. He seemed insistent that she stay. Are you afraid of being alone? Rickon didn't respond immediately, meaning yes. I don't like saying goodbye anymore. First to you and Arya, then Robb and Mother, then Bran. I never got the chance to say it to some of my friends when they died at the Wall. I just wish things were how they were when we were all together. Sansa remembered when she was the complete opposite. She couldn't wait to get away from Winterfell and go to King's Landing. Then the day came that all she wanted to do was go home. The day she watched her father murdered. Me too. Rickon sighed and sat up. I'll speak to Maester Wolkan tomorrow about drawing up some documents and arrange for your travels. So soon? I meant it in the sense of when you didn't need me here any longer, she chuckled. Ah, I thought you meant, oh. He cleared his throat. How long do you think that will be? How about after you get married and the new Lady Stark sits beside you, instead of me? I think I can be all right with that. But it's still just a tower. Sansa recalled when Arya backed her into a corner after becoming Queen of the North. How she accused her of always liking pretty things. She wouldn't deny that she did, and there wasn't anything wrong with that. Arya liked to be a fighter and she liked to be a lady of the court, and she had seen the tower and the remains of the village when they all rode for the Wall. In a few years, I think I can turn it into a good holdfast, but if you want to renovate it, well, if it's even possible, I won't stop you. It will be a good home for me.
Oh, wow.
She almost let the secret out, but as she thought about it, maybe the reason she felt so withdrawn in herself was that she was keeping it a secret. Perhaps Gilly was right. She was overcomplicating it. It will be a good home for me and my child. What? Child? He looked at Sansa wide-eyed only for her to nod and slip a hand over her stomach. Is it a snow? Does that make you uncomfortable? Sansa asked. That's supposed to be my question. Sansa shook her head. No, it doesn't. She took a moment to let herself believe her own words. It really doesn't. In a way, I feel glad that it happened. It was something that assured her that she didn't fear the memories of what she suffered. If you really are sure about this, then you have my support. But I'm sure if you asked Jon, he wouldn't hesitate to naturalize your child. Sansa shook her head. Just because this child won't have my name, it doesn't mean it won't have my love. It's time that we try to change how we see people. Not for their names, but their quality. Jon's proof enough of that, Rickon agreed, as he lightly bounced Aemon in his arms. He spent just as much time with the twins as Sansa did, and was doing an excellent job. He was practically a big brother watching over them. They're so chubby. Watching him be a gentle soul made Sansa smile. She sat in her armchair, with Matthias in her arms. He was sound asleep, but had a hand latched onto her finger quite tightly. I remember you were even more so when you were a baby, back when their world was all they could ever ask for. Sansa looked over to the two Dane children who were sitting on her bed with Aemon's dragon egg, the red one. Darrold was rubbing his hands on the scaled texture over and over like he was petting it. Ashara was sitting next to him and playing with a small doll and a wooden knight. Edric had some duties he had to take care of today with Cetero Martell. For the past few weeks they had been corresponding with their vassal houses to arrange for Starfall to be rebuilt. She still hadn't told him that she was carrying his child within her. It troubled her more than confronting Edric about sleeping with him. She tried to imagine being scolded by her mother. For some reason, it put her at ease because of how ironic everything had become for her. Arya never wanted to be a lady, but now she was married to a great lord. Sansa wanted to be the perfect lady for her mother, but now she had a bastard within her. Despite how things were, she wasn't ashamed of herself for it. This was a child born of the love between two people. She thought if Jon really was her father's bastard, then would the honorable Ned Stark have acted the same? Would he still have taken Jon into his home? Years ago, she wouldn't have. She didn't understand what it truly meant. But now she felt so differently. She didn't feel that the child within her was a child of sin, like the faith taught them to be. But that was the teachings of the faith of the Seven, not the North. In the North, a man gets what he earns. She did not have a single doubt that her child would prove their quality. While they all enjoyed their peace, Maester Wolkan silently entered the room. "Pardon, my lord, my lady," a raven arrived from the south. The old maester broke into a smile. House Targaryen took King's Landing. The crown is victorious. Sansa lost the air in her lungs when she heard the news. It was overwhelming information that brought such a wave of joy to her heart. After a decade of war and fighting, the monsters responsible for so much pain and death were defeated. She looked to Rickon and saw that he was just as joyful as she was. He was smiling greatly, but keeping his excitement contained while he held Aemon. "We should announce it to everyone," he almost yelled. "Send for the wet nurse to watch over the babes and gather the household in the courtyard," Sansa ordered the master. "I shall let them know personally." "At once, my lady." Wolkan left, and Sansa set Matthias down in his crib, and Rickon did the same with Aemon.
Rashara, Geralt,
The two Dane children looked up at her. "Would you like to come with us?" Geralt nodded, and crawled off the bed, and then gently placed the egg back in Aemon's crib. Ashara looked up to Sansa. "Does this mean we are going home?" "Yes, it does. The fighting is done, and now we have dragons to watch over us, and keep us safe." Ashara smiled momentarily, but it faded, and she grew sad. "Are you all right?" Sansa asked before tears began to well up in the purple eyes of Ashara Dane. "Rickon could take Geralt outside and wait for us, please?" He nodded silently and did as asked, while Sansa sat Ashara back on the bed and listened. "Tell me what's wrong," Sansa asked softly. "I don't want to go home," Ashara cried quietly. "Why not? Is it because someone broke your home?" Ashara shook her head. "Do you like it here?" "Yes, but that's not why. It's because Mama's not coming with us. She can't cause. She's gone." Sansa took a deep breath as she felt the weight of the little girl's pain. No child as young as that should have had to witness what they all did, It was beyond terrible. She always took me to pick apples. I always found the tastiest. Now, we won't do it anymore. Sansa wrapped her arms around Ashara and held her tightly. I lost my mother too, and my father and my brother, a long time ago. Some very bad people took them from me. From all of us. Ashara looked up to her, hiccuping from her sobs. Do you miss them? Sansa nodded. Every day. Then how come you're not crying too? Because they're never truly gone. They'll always be a part of me. Just like your mother is always a part of you. As long as you believe in that, they'll always live on in our memories, our dreams, and through us. She wiped her thumb across Ashara's soft cheeks, removing the streaks of tears that remained. It's okay, she whispered. First, they rejoined the boys, then went to the Great Hall, where Edric and Sarala were. The two of them were at a table with documents and raven scrolls. They were going over. Sarala noticed them since she was sitting on the furthest side of the table. Lord Stark, Lady Sansa. Sarala greeted. Edric turned his body and smiled when he saw his two children. My lord and lady. He greeted. Lady Martell, Lord Dane, we received news from the south, and will be announcing it now to the people. Would you care to join us? Edric nodded. Absolutely. He and Sarala got out of their seats, and Edric held out his hand for one of his children. Gerald was the one who let go of Sansa and joined his papa, but Ashara remained to hold on to her. Together they all walked outside to the balconies. Both soldiers and common folk had gathered around. Sansa stood forward and gave them the news. Winter came for Cersei Lannister. House Targaryen reigns once again. We are victorious. The people rejoiced to hear the news. Many of them began to hug one another. Even the wildlings took joy in the news. One of the soldiers shouted for joy at the top of his lungs. The war is over. The people cheered with him. Sansa smiled at the joy of her people. Tonight, there will be ale and wine for all as a gift of celebration, she announced. Many of the common folk grew happier at the sound of that. If their food stores were kind to them, she would have had a feast thrown. Perhaps she would arrange one when the first flowers of spring bloomed. Sansa turned to Edric and saw him bouncing his son. His arms. Gerald laughed in joy with his father. As evening quickly approached, the great hall was set up to house as many as possible. Meat and drink were brought and music began to play out. Some of the small folk were dancing with each other, while others engaged in drinking contests. There was much laughter and a great many toasts held for those that made all of this possible. Despite the celebration, Sansa kept herself from partaking of any ale and wine. She had to excuse herself twice to vomit after the smells of the meats made her sick to her very core. But she still shared in the company of friends and laughed with them. She got embarrassed when Tywin told many about their kiss after she escaped King's Landing. But Sarala was kind enough to share an equally embarrassing story of her half-sister involving a Dornish treat and horse dung. One of the musicians, a lute player, had started singing a new song as he plucked the strings of his lute. It was about two dragons, one among wolves and crows, and the other among horses and harpies. While one battled in the ice, the other battled in the fire. When winter came, they stood together and conquered the cold and lifted the sun to rise. It needed a little bit of work, but it had the potential to be a song to rival the Rains of Castamere given how much resentment there remained for the Lannisters. Willa, a girl's voice yelled over the noise of laughing. Sansa turned her attention and saw Rickon sitting with his friend Jonna. Her cheek was covered in what might have been pudding. Jonna was looking over to her sister, who had a spoon in her hand, fresh from flinging the food. Willow was giggling with a girl next to her. They continued to tease Jonna as she chased after them in the great hall. Rickon laughed as he and his friend Ruggery sat and watched. All the excitement began to be a bit too much. Sansa decided to go outside for a breath of cold air to freshen her mind and get out of the smell. She took to the battlements and gazed out to the fields all around as the sun was on the eve of setting. The huts the wildlings built to house the armies for the war against the dead now housed many of the refugees that needed proper shelter and care. It looked like a city almost. Perhaps it should become just that in a few years. But her eyes were mostly fixed on the sky. There wasn't a cloud to be seen in any direction, and the sun was nearly finished setting. She couldn't recall when it had felt so clear before. So this was what peace was like. She heard the faint of faint footsteps approaching, and was joined by Edric soon after. He stood by and looked outwards with her. Before winter set in, I never thought that House Targaryen would return to become the reigning power of Westeros, let alone that I would be fighting for them. So many years fighting, it will be interesting to see what a few of them will be like with peace. She turned to face him and saw that he was just as calmly happy as she was. A part of me still wonders how long it will last until the next one starts. Will we ever grow out of war? He shrugged as he stood next to her. Unfortunately, it's a part of us. The best we can do is to make sure it's waged for a damn good reason. He looked out to the view and let there be a still silence between them. Sansa felt that the time was now. He needed to know. Edric, there's something you should know. Her smile died, but she didn't feel afraid to tell him anymore. I'm with child, your child. Edric's body winced before his head perked up at her, eyes widened. His shock was hard to read. Sansa couldn't tell if he was worried or just plain surprised. Are you sure? She nodded in response. I want you to know that it's not your fault. So much happened, I forgot to take precautions. It just slipped from me. Edric's face went firm. What do you want to do? Sansa didn't notice when her hand smoothed over her belly. I'm going to give birth to it, nurture it, watch it grow and be a mother to it. She looked at him calmly. What do you want to do? She asked back. Edric heaved out a great breath and leaned his elbows on the stone. I'm so sorry that I'll not let your honor be sullied for this. Sansa placed a hand on his shoulder, stopping his words. I don't mean what does duty and honor demand. I mean what do you want to do? He took a minute to gather his thoughts. My lady. Sansa, just Sansa for right now. Please. Sansa. While Dorne takes lightly to bastards, the rest of the kingdoms don't. I don't want you looked down on for this. He stood up as straight as he could. I will do what I can, and I'll start by asking for your— Stop, Sansa interrupted, knowing full well what he was about to ask. But Sansa— Edric, it's all right, she said. I don't care what the rest of the damn world will think of my child as. A stain on my honor, a sully of my value. They can choke on goat shit. This child was born out of love, not lust or desire. She took his hands in hers and had the bravery to smile at him. I'm in love you, Edric Dane. But if I were to marry you, it has to be for the same reason, not because it's a duty or the honorable thing. He looked disappointed, not like a parent would when their child did something naughty, but more heartbroken. I want that as well. His hold tightened ever so slightly. Sansa slipped her hands out of Edric's. But right now, what you need to do is go home. Rebuild what you've lost. Take care of your family. They need you a great deal more. He nodded at her and was gladdened by her words. Just promise me one thing, Edric told her with a hint of a smile. Make sure I know when you are close to giving birth. I've never missed any of my children entering the world, and don't plan to. As night fell, the festivities died down, and some took to sleep while others took to the company to their beds. Sansa was not one of these many and preferred it to be alone tonight. Luckily, the echoes of passion were quieter than a whispering mouse. With her furs wrapped around her in a lovely warmth, she looked up to the ceiling above. For the first time in a long time, she didn't picture the deaths of those she lost. She pictured them at peace and avenged. As Sansa laid in her bed, she rested her hand on her stomach, hoping that her child would grow strong within her. Sleep weighed on her eyes, and she felt the pull rest.